Hey fam, this is Goofy Harry. Today's story is gonna blow your mind. What if Robb survived the Red Wedding, then refused to kneel to King Jon? Show some love with a like and subscribe. Here we go. Chapter 1. The man they buried there was singing before the pain came back. Robb Stark did not know it was singing at first. It sounded like the sea, if the sea had words in it, rising and falling in a woman's voice that cracked on the high notes. He lay somewhere dark and smelled wood smoke and boiled turnips and something else beneath it, sharp and metallic, that he would later understand was his own blood soaked so deep into a straw pallet that no amount of scrubbing would ever get it out. He tried to open his eyes and found that only one of them worked. The other was swollen shut, crusted, throbbing in time with his heartbeat, which was itself a slow and terrible thing. A drum someone was beating too hard, too close. Gray wind, he thought before he thought anything else. Not his mother's name, not Talus's. The wolf's first, because some animal part of him remembered the howling that had cut off too suddenly, remembered the wet sound of something large falling, and some deeper animal part of him already knew what that meant and did not want to know it yet. "Don't move," a voice said. A young man's voice, wavering, trying to sound steady and failing. "You'll open it again. I only just got the bleeding to stop." Robb turned his head, that much he could do, and the room came into blurred focus. Low ceiling, black with old smoke, a single tallow candle guttering on a stool, and a face he knew, though it took him a long moment to place it, swimming as it was above him like something seen through water. Oliver Frey, one of the sons. The one who'd been Robb's own squire once in that long-ago spring when the war had still felt like it might be won cleanly, like there was such a thing as a clean war. "You're dead," Robb said. His voice came out as a papery whisper, and it hurt his ribs to make even that much sound. "I watched." He stopped. He hadn't watched anything. He'd been on his back with a crossbow bolt in his belly and Catelyn's scream in his ears. And after that there had only been red and then black and then nothing at all. "No," Oliver said. "You're the one who was dead. Everyone thinks so. My father thinks so. Lord Bolton thinks so. That's rather the point, my lord. You have to keep on being dead a while longer, or none of this was worth doing." Robb tried to sit up. Pain exploded through his midsection like a second stabbing, and he made a sound he was ashamed of. A wounded animal sound, and fell back against the pallet with sweat breaking cold across his skin. "I said don't move." Oliver's hands were on his shoulders, gentle but firm, pressing him down. Up close the boy looked wrecked, hollow-eyed, unshaven, a tremor in his jaw that wouldn't quite settle. "You've a hole in your gut that should have killed you outright. It would have, if the bolt had gone 2 inches to the left. As it stands, you've been fevered 8 days, and I've lost count of how many times I thought I'd wake and find you'd finally stopped breathing. 8 days. The number meant nothing and everything at once. 8 days since the twins. 8 days since the music had stopped, and the doors had been barred, and Robb Stark, king in the north, had watched his own bannermen die around a wedding table with crossbow bolts in their chests. Had watched Roose Bolton drive a dagger up under his mother's chin, while the words "the Lannisters send their regards" still hung in the smoky air. "Where?" Robb said, and could not finish the question because there were too many people the word could be asking after, and he was afraid of every single answer. Oliver understood him anyway. That was the terrible mercy and the terrible cruelty of the boy. He understood, and he didn't flinch from telling the truth, even knowing what it would do. "Lady Catelyn is dead, my lord. I'm sorry. I saw it happen and I couldn't. There was nothing I could have done. There were 40 men in that hall with crossbows already loosed. Your wife," his voice caught. "Talisa, she's dead too. I'm so sorry. She was near the doors. She never had a chance to run." Robb closed his working eye. Something in his chest that had been holding very still, very carefully, like a man balanced on a rope over a long drop, simply let go. He did not weep. He did not have the strength left in his body to weep. The fever had burned all the water out of him, But something worse than weeping happened. A kind of silent, dry convulsion that had no tears in it at all, just shudders, just the awful hitching of ribs that had been broken and were healing wrong. "Gray wind," he said finally when he could speak again, though he already knew, though some part of him had known since the first moment of waking. "They killed him too," Oliver said. "Chained him in the yard for the feast so he couldn't come to your aid. He got loose when the fighting started, killed 3 men before they brought him down with crossbows. I heard he took a long time to die. I'm sorry, my lord. I know what he was to you. What he was to you. As if Gray Wind had been a hound, a good hunting dog, a possession to be mourned the way a man mourns a favorite horse." Oliver didn't mean it that way. Robb could hear in the boy's voice that he was trying, in his clumsy, grief-stricken way, to say something kind. But the words still landed like another wound, because there was no way to explain to anyone who hadn't lived it what it had been like to have another mind beside your own. A second set of eyes. A second heart beating in time with yours since before either of you had teeth enough to hunt with. Gray Wind had been the last piece of Robb that still felt like the boy he'd been before the war, before the crown, before all of this. And now that boy was gone too, burned out of him along with everything else, and what was left lying on this filthy straw pallet in the dark was something else. Something Robb did not yet have a name for. "My mother's men," he said. "Her guard, the Karstarks, the Glovers. Is there anyone? Most of the Northmen died in the hall or in the yard after," Oliver said. "Some of your bannermen who weren't at the feast, those camped outside the walls, they were attacked too, but not all of them." "I don't have good numbers, my lord. It happened very fast and very badly, and I was trying to keep you breathing rather than counting corpses." He said this last part with a flare of something almost like anger, and Robb realized dimly, distantly, that the boy was exhausted and frightened, and had probably been alone with this secret, and this burden for 8 days straight, hiding a supposedly dead king in what smelled like a fisherman's hut somewhere along the riverbank, waiting for either Robb to die or his own father's men to find them both. "Why," Robb said. It was the only word he had strength for, but it carried the whole shape of the question. "Why did you do this? Why did you save me? Why would a Frey risk his father's wrath and his own life to drag a dying enemy king out of a massacre his own house had orchestrated?" Oliver was quiet a long moment. He picked up a rag, dipped it in a bowl of water gone pink with old blood, and began, with surprising gentleness, to clean around the edge of the wound at Robb's side, a task that must have become terribly familiar to him over the last 8 days. "My father made me a party to murder," he said at last, not looking up. "He told us the plan 2 days before. Not all of it, not that they meant to gut your direwolf and cut down unarmed men at a wedding feast under guest right. No, he was cleverer than that. He only told us there'd be an opportunity, and that we were to be ready to act when the music changed. I didn't know what that meant until the music changed." His hands had gone still on the rag. "I've broken guest right now too, my lord, by helping you. There's no coming back from either side of that. I am already damned by my father's oath-breaking, and I will be doubly damned when he finds out what I did after. So I suppose the honest answer is that I had already lost everything that mattered by staying loyal to my house, and I don't know what I thought. I thought if I was going to be damned regardless, I might as well be damned for doing one right thing." It was, Robb thought through the fog of fever and grief, one of the strangest and most honest things anyone had ever said to him. He had grown up around men who spoke in certainties. His father's certainty of honor, Theon's certainty of charm, great Jon Umber's certainty of strength. And here was a boy telling him, in effect, "I did the good thing because the bad thing was already done, and I couldn't stand doing nothing at all." It was not the language of songs. It was the language of a person who had actually had to choose, in the dark, in the noise, with blood already on the floor. "Thank you," Robb managed, though the words felt absurdly small for what they were meant to cover. "Don't thank me yet," Oliver said. "You're not out of the woods, my lord, you're not even out of the county. My father's men have been combing the riverbank for stragglers since the wedding. If they find you here, they'll kill us both, and slowly, and my father will probably compose a song about it after." A ghost of dark humor in that last line, the first Robb had heard from him, and something loosened very slightly in Robb's chest at the sound of it, proof, however small, that laughter still existed somewhere in the world, even here, even now. The days that followed had no real shape to them. Robb slept more than he woke, and when he woke it was into pain that came in waves, cresting and receding like something tidal, something that obeyed laws he had no power over. Oliver fed him broth spooned between cracked lips, changed the dressing on the wound with hands that grew steadier each time. And twice, when Robb's fever spiked so high that he began speaking to people who weren't there. His father mostly, and once terribly, to Bran, as though his little brother were still safely tucked away at Winterfell and not, so far as anyone in the world believed, dead in a burning tower at Winterfell itself. Oliver sat up through the night pressing cool cloths to his brow and murmuring things Robb couldn't remember afterward. Low, steady nonsense meant only to anchor a drowning man to the sound of another voice. On the 6th day after Robb first woke, he was strong enough to sit up unassisted and strong enough, too, to ask the question he had been avoiding. "How did you get me out?" Oliver was mending a tear in his own cloak. His hands needed something to do, Robb had noticed, whenever the conversation turned toward the wedding itself. There was chaos in the hall for a long while after, bodies everywhere, men still finishing off the wounded, my father giving orders. "I found you under 2 other men near the wall. You were breathing barely. I don't know why I checked. I think I only wanted to be sure the king I'd sworn to once was actually dead, so I could stop feeling anything about it." He tied off the thread, bit it. "When I found you weren't, I panicked, honestly. I got you out through the side door that leads down to the boats, told the man on watch there that I was disposing of a corpse in the river, which was near enough true that my voice didn't even shake very much. I put you in a boat and rowed you 2 miles down river in the dark, and I have been telling everyone since that I went to visit a girl in Fairmarket, which, my lord, is going to become an extremely awkward lie to maintain if my father ever actually asks the girl in Fairmarket." Robb almost laughed. It surprised him. The impulse laughter felt like a language he'd forgotten how to speak, something from another life, another man's life. But it came, small and rusty, and it hurt his ribs, and it felt, despite the pain, like the first true thing his body had done since he woke that wasn't grief or agony. "You're braver than most knights I've met," he said, when the small fit had passed. "I'm a coward who got lucky," Oliver said without bitterness, simply stating what he seemed to believe was fact. "A brave man would have stopped it before it happened. I only mopped up afterward." "A brave man tried to stop it and died for it," Robb said. He was thinking of his own men, of the Umbers, the Karstarks who'd stayed loyal, the household guard who'd have gone for their swords the moment the first crossbow loosed and been cut down before they cleared the scabbard. "You did the only thing that was left to do, and you did it well. There's no shame in that. There's no shame in surviving, Oliver. I used to think there was. I don't anymore." He meant it, though it cost him something to say it, because the honest continuation of that thought was. And I don't know yet whether that's wisdom or whether it's the fever talking, whether I've simply had every certainty burned out of me, and this is just the ash where they used to be. It was on the 9th day, when Robb could walk badly, leaning on a stick Oliver had cut and shaped for him, but walk, that the boy told him where they truly were, and what had happened while Robb slept away his fever in ignorance. They were in a fisherman's abandoned croft 2 miles below the Twins, on the western bank, a squat structure of daub and river stone that had clearly not sheltered anyone in years before Oliver dragged a dying king into it. Through the single crooked window Robb could see gray water moving sluggish and slow, and beyond it, faint on the horizon, smoke, always smoke, this far into a war that had burned half the riverlands to char. "Lord Bolton has been named Warden of the North," Oliver said. He'd clearly been holding this back, waiting for Robb to be strong enough to hear it without the shock killing him outright. "By order of the Iron Throne, Tywin Lannister's doing the reward for what happened at the wedding. He's riding for Winterfell even now, or near enough now, to take up the seat. And there's word," he hesitated. "Say it. Your brothers, my lord, Bran and Rickon." Word came before the wedding, and no one said different since, that they died at Winterfell when the Ironborn took it. Burned in the towers, some say. Or that the Boltons, Ramsay Snow, that's Lord Bolton's bastard, that he's the one who actually holds Winterfell now in his father's name, killed the Ironborn holding it and flayed them for the crime, and there were 2 boys' bodies found in the wreckage after, burned too badly to be sure who they were, but everyone's taken it to mean they're not dead. Oliver blinked. "My lord, Bran and Rickon, they're not dead." Robb didn't know how he knew this, some old certainty from before, some faith he'd had in his little brother's cleverness that the war hadn't yet managed to kill, a stubbornness that refused, simply refused, to let this particular grief in alongside all the others he was already drowning in. Bran wouldn't die in a tower. He'd find a way out. He always did, even before he couldn't walk. He found ways into and out of places no one thought a boy could reach. If 2 bodies were burned past knowing, that tells me someone made very sure they'd be mistaken for 2 particular boys. That's not an accident. That's Bran's doing, or someone helping him do it. He said it with more confidence than he had any right to feel. Lying wounded in a stranger's hovel with half a kingdom's worth of grief already sitting on his chest. And yet saying it aloud made it feel truer, made it feel like something to hold onto besides rage. A small coal of hope that he cupped his hands around and refused to let the wind take. Because if he let it go, if he let himself believe Bran and Rickon were truly ash in a burned tower, he did not think there would be enough of him left afterward to do anything at all, vengeance included. Oliver didn't argue. Perhaps he didn't have the heart to. "There's more, my lord. Your sister, Lady Sansa, she's still held in King's Landing. Married off to Tyrion Lannister, the word says, some weeks back. And your uncle Edmure, my father had him wed to my sister Rosalind the very night of the wedding, before the killing started. Called out of the hall for the bedding ceremony, which is likely the only reason he's alive at all. He wasn't in the room when the crossbows came out." Rosalind. Robb remembered her, dimly, a shy pretty thing, one of Walder Frey's endless daughters, offered up as part of the marriage pact that Robb himself had broken by wedding Talisa instead. He felt a distant, exhausted pity for her, married into all of this, likely as much a pawn in her father's schemes as anyone else in that hall had been a victim of them. "They've got Edmure locked up somewhere in the Twins," Oliver went on. "Riverrun's under siege. The Lannisters and my father mean to starve it out, force your Grey-Tuncle the Blackfish to yield it. That's the last I heard before I stopped being able to leave you long enough to gather news properly." Robb sat with all of it a long moment, the crown lost, the North handed to the man who'd murdered his mother, his sister a captive bride in the capital, his uncle a hostage, Riverrun under siege, his little brothers perhaps dead, perhaps not, and no way yet to know which. It was, by any reasonable measure, the complete and total destruction of everything he had built and everything his father had left him. A lesser man, or perhaps only a different man, Robb was no longer certain lesser was the right word for it, would have looked at that ledger and simply lain back down on the pallet and waited for the fever to finish what the crossbow bolt had started. Instead, something in Robb's chest that had gone very quiet and very cold in the days since the wedding began slowly to burn. "Bring me a map," he said, "if you have one. If not, draw me one from memory. I need to know exactly what's between here and Riverrun and exactly how many men Bolton's left holding this stretch of river." Oliver stared at him. "My lord, you can barely stand." "I can stand," Robb said. "I can hold a stick and I can stand, and every day I'll stand a little longer, and every day I'll ask you more questions. And by the time I'm strong enough to hold a sword again, I intend to already know the shape of the war I'm about to fight. I've been given a gift, Oliver. Everyone in this kingdom believes I'm dead. That means for as long as I can keep them believing it, I can move where a living king could never move, and strike where a living king would be expected. And by the time Roose Bolton learns the truth, it will already be too late for him to do anything about it." He looked up, and something in his face must have shown the boy exactly how much had changed in him, because Oliver's expression shifted from concern to something closer to wariness. "I am not going to sit in this hut and grieve until grief is all that's left of me. I did enough of that in the first 9 days. My mother is dead. My wife is dead. My unborn child is dead. My direwolf is dead. I have exactly nothing left to lose, which means I have nothing left to be careful of, which means every man who thinks he's safe because I'm dead is about to learn how wrong he is." The words came out harder and colder than anything Robb Stark had said in his life, and he heard the change in his own voice as he said them and did not entirely recognize it, and did not, if he was honest with himself, entirely mind it either. There had been a boy who marched south from Winterfell believing that honor and right and the love of good men would be enough to win a war. That boy had died somewhere between the Green Fork and the Twins, killed by his own naive certainty as surely as any crossbow bolt. What remained was colder, harder, but it was also, and this frightened him a little in the small, honest hours before dawn when the pain kept him from sleep and he had nothing to do but think, more useful. Grief made a man weep. Rage, properly banked and fed and shaped, made a man dangerous. And dangerous, Robb thought, was exactly what he needed to become if he meant to do anything about any of what had happened to him and the people he'd loved. "There's a map," Oliver said slowly, "in my saddlebag. Rough, but it'll do. My lord, before you ask me to help you plan a war, I need to know what you mean to do with it, because if it's simply revenge on my father, on my house entire, I'll help you regardless. God knows they've earned it 100 times over. But if it's revenge on everyone who ever wore a Frey sigil or served at that wedding, including men who had no more choice in it than I did." "I know the difference," Robb said. "My father taught me the difference long before any of this happened. The men who loosed the crossbows, who planned the slaughter, who knew and smiled and drank wine while it happened, those men answer to me, every one, and I will find every one of them if it takes the rest of my life. The men who were ordered to stand at doors and didn't know what waited on the other side of the music changing, that's different. You're proof enough of that. I don't make war on frightened boys who didn't choose their fathers." He met Oliver's eyes. "But Walder Frey chose. Roose Bolton chose. Every man who planned that wedding chose, with open eyes, to break the oldest law guests and hosts have ever shared between them, to murder my mother and my wife and my child and my men under a roof that was supposed to make us all safe. There is no corner of the 7 kingdoms far enough for them to hide from what's coming. I swear that to you now, on whatever's left of my honor, because you're the only living soul who knows I'm alive to swear it, and I need you to believe me when I say it." Oliver was quiet a long moment. Then he nodded once and went to fetch the map. The days blurred into a rhythm after that, a hard, deliberate rhythm that Robb built for himself with the same stubbornness he'd once used to convince his father's bannermen to follow a 15-year-old boy to war. Each morning he walked, further each day, first to the door of the croft and back, then down to the river's edge and back, then, by the end of the second week, a full mile along the bank before the wound in his side forced him to stop and sit and breathe through the pain until it passed. Each afternoon he studied the map, badly drawn as it was, memorizing fords and roads and the rough disposition of Frey and Bolton forces as Olivar's memory, and the occasional risky trip to a nearby village for news could supply them. Each evening he ate whatever Olivar could scrounge, fish mostly, and the odd stolen chicken, and once memorably, a rabbit Robb himself managed to snare despite still walking with a stick, a small victory that felt disproportionately enormous at the time. And each night, before sleep took him, Robb allowed himself exactly 1 hour of grief. He decided on this discipline early. 1 hour, no more, in which he let himself remember Talus's laugh, or the particular way his mother used to sit very straight when she was worried and trying not to show it, or the warm, solid weight of Grey Wind's head on his knee beside a campfire in some forgotten field a lifetime ago. He let the grief come in full during that hour, let it hurt as badly as it wanted to hurt, and then, when the hour ended, he made himself set it down, the way you'd set down a heavy pack at the end of a long march, not because the weight was gone, but because you couldn't carry it and walk at the same time, and walking was the only thing that mattered now. It was not healthy, perhaps. Olivar, watching him from across the small fire some nights, clearly thought it wasn't. There was a particular look the boy got, equal parts admiration and worry, when Robb would stop mid-sentence at the mention of some detail that summoned Talusa or Catelyn to mind, go very still and very white for the space of several breaths, and then continue speaking about troop numbers as if nothing had happened at all. "You're allowed to grieve properly, my lord," Olivar said once quietly after one of these silences. "I don't think anyone would think less of you for it. You've lost more than most men lose in a lifetime, and you've lost it all in the space of one evening." "I know I'm allowed," Robb said. "I'm choosing not to. Not because it isn't there, it's there, Olivar. It's there every hour of every day, I promise you that. But grief doesn't win wars, and it doesn't get my sister out of King's Landing, and it doesn't put a knife in Roose Bolton's throat, and those are the things I need to be capable of doing. So I'm keeping it where I can reach it, because I think I'll need it eventually. I think a man who can't feel anything at all is as dangerous to himself as a man who feels too much, but I'm not going to let it stop my feet from moving. My mother didn't raise me to lie down and die of sorrow. She raised me to survive winters that killed weaker men, and this is just a longer, crueler winter than any I've faced before. I mean to survive this one too." It was, he would reflect later, the truest thing he said in those first weeks, truer even than the vow of vengeance, because the vow of vengeance was simple, was almost easy, in the way that hatred is always easier than grief. The harder truth, the one he was only beginning to understand himself, was that surviving this particular winter was going to require him to become something colder than he had been, and he was going to have to decide, eventually, whether he could become that thing without losing the parts of himself that had made him worth following in the first place. Word reached them near the end of the third week, carried by Olivar from a market day trip to a village 2 hours upriver, that changed the shape of everything. "Riverrun's still holding," Olivar said, dropping into the croft breathless from the ride, cheeks flushed with more than just cold. "The Blackfish has them stymied, won't yield, won't be starved out easy, and there's talk he slipped men out at night to harry the besiegers. And there's more, my lord, there's word out of King's Landing." He hesitated, and Robb, sitting with the map spread across his knees, felt his stomach tighten before the boy even said it. "Joffrey Baratheon is dead," Olivar said. "Poisoned at his own wedding feast not a fortnight past. Killed at the table, in front of half the kingdom, and no one's quite sure yet who did it, though every finger in 3 kingdoms is pointing somewhere different. Tyrion Lannister's been arrested for it. His own wife's brother stands accused of murdering him, if you can credit that, given your sister's now married to the man. Robb sat very still. Joffrey Baratheon, the boy king who had ordered his father's head struck from his shoulders on the steps of the Great Sept, the act that had started this entire war in truth, whatever excuses were offered afterward about honor and succession and legitimacy. Dead. Poisoned. Choked to death, if the reports Olyvar had gathered were accurate, in front of a hall full of lords and ladies, his face going purple, clawing at his own throat while his mother screamed. He should have felt satisfaction. He searched himself for it and found, instead, something stranger and more complicated. A kind of grim, weary recognition that the world did not, in fact, dispense justice in any way that made sense or brought comfort. That Joffrey's death changed nothing about his own mother lying in an unmarked grave somewhere near the twins. Changed nothing about Talisa, about Grey Wind, about any of the ledger of losses Robb was carrying. The boy king was dead and the world kept turning exactly as cruelly as it had before. Who rules now? He asked instead, because that was the question that mattered. Tommen, they say, the younger brother, crowned already or soon to be, a child king, and everyone knows it, which means Tywin Lannister rules in truth, same as he always has. Nothing's changed there, my lord, not in any way that helps us. No, Robb agreed. But it tells me something useful all the same. It tells me the Lannisters are distracted, a dead king, a trial for regicide, a new boy on the throne who needs propping up on all sides. Tywin Lannister has his hands full in King's Landing. He won't be watching the Riverlands as closely as he was a month ago. That's a door, Olyvar, not a wide one, but a door. A door to what exactly? Olyvar asked, and there was an edge of genuine apprehension in his voice now, as though he suspected he already knew the answer and didn't much like it. Robb looked down at the map, at the crude ink lines showing fords and roads, at the mark Olyvar had made for the twins, at the long, uncertain space between where they sat now and Riverrun, still holding, still his mother's family seat, still garrisoned in his name, even if his name was believed to belong to a dead man. A door to becoming something the Lannisters and the Freys and Roose Bolton never planned for, he said. They killed the king in the north at a wedding table. They're building their whole future on that fact. Bolton's lordship, Frey's new lands. All of it rests on Robb Stark being dead and buried and no longer a piece on the board. So the last thing any of them are prepared for, the very last thing, is for that piece to come back onto the board when they've already stopped watching for it. He rolled the map carefully and looked up at Olyvar, and something in his one good eye must have carried enough of the old fire, the fire that had once made grown lords kneel to a boy not yet 20, because Olyvar sat back a little as though bracing himself. I'm not going to Riverrun to hide behind its walls, Robb went on. I'm strong enough to ride near enough, and I mean to use every week I have left of being a dead man wisely. I want you to help me find the men who survived the twins. There will be some, scattered, hiding, ashamed they ran or ashamed they lived when their king supposedly didn't. I want to find the Northmen who are still loyal and haven't yet sworn to Bolton simply because there was no one else left to swear to. I want to know exactly how thin Bolton's garrison is stretched holding down a north that never once loved him and never will. And when I have enough men and enough knowledge, I am going to walk back into this war like the ghost story every soldier in the 7 kingdoms is about to start telling their children. And I am going to make Roose Bolton wish, very sincerely, that he had checked the bodies more carefully before he claimed his reward. Outside the crooked window, the river moved on, indifferent. The way it had moved for 1,000 years before this war, and would move for 1,000 years after it, carrying silt and driftwood, and the reflected gray light of a sky that couldn't decide whether it meant to rain. Robb watched it a moment, feeling the ache in his side that would, he suspected, never entirely leave him, feeling the colder ache further in. The one with Catelyn's face and Talus's laugh and Grey Wind's low contented growl all folded into it. And let both aches settle into the same place he'd been keeping them since he woke. Held, not healed, banked like coals under ash, ready to be fed when the time came. "There's one more thing you should know before we go any further with this," Olyvar said quietly, after a silence that had stretched long enough to feel like its own kind of answer. "My father isn't a fool, whatever else he is, and Roose Bolton is far less a fool than my father. If word ever reaches either of them that you're alive, and my lord, forgive me, but word travels, secrets don't keep forever, not in a war with this many frightened, hungry, desperate men moving through it. They will not simply try to kill you again. They'll be ready for it this time. They'll expect the ghost story. Bolton especially, he's the coldest, most careful man I've ever heard my father speak of with anything like respect, and my father doesn't respect many people. He'll have thought of this already, somewhere in that quiet mind of his. A contingency. He'll have asked himself what he'd do if the king in the north turned out not to be quite so dead as everyone hoped, because that is precisely the kind of thing a man like Roose Bolton plans for even when he thinks it unlikely. Robb considered this, turning it over the way he'd learned to turn over every piece of intelligence since the war began, not dismissing it, not letting it frighten him either, simply weighing it, fitting it into the shape of the war to come. "Then I'll have to be more careful than the ghost story he's imagining," he said finally, "and more dangerous than the contingency he's planned for. Roose Bolton is a patient, careful man, Olyvar. You're right to fear him more than your father. But patient, careful men have one weakness that reckless men don't." He looked back down at the rolled map in his hands, and for the first time since he'd woken in this hovel, something that was almost, not quite, but almost, a smile touched the corner of his mouth. They plan for the dangers they can imagine. They very rarely plan for a man who no longer has anything left to lose, and has therefore stopped being careful about the same things they are. I intend to be exactly that man, and I intend for Roose Bolton to learn what that means the hard way, in his own good time, when it's already far too late for careful plans to save him. Olyvar Frey looked at the man he'd dragged half-dead out of a slaughterhouse 3 weeks before, thinner now than he'd been, scarred in ways that would never fully fade, one eye still not quite right in dim light, walking with a stick he'd need for months yet, and saw, underneath all of it, something that made him afraid in a way the massacre itself hadn't quite managed to. Not afraid of Robb, afraid for the world that Robb Stark was about to walk back into, believing itself finished with him, believing the North safely won and the war safely over. He said nothing more that night. There was, he suspected, nothing more to say. He simply banked the fire, laid out the blankets, and let the king in the North, dead to the world, and increasingly something the world had never quite seen before, sleep the last easy sleep he'd have for a very long time. Chapter 2. Ashes and Iron. The mountain clansmen found them before Robb found the mountain clansmen, which was, Olyvar Frey would say afterward, either the luckiest or unluckiest thing that had happened to either of them since the wedding, depending entirely on how the next few minutes went. There were 4 of them, come out of the tree line so quietly that Robb only knew they were there when a low voice said, "Don't reach for that stick, lad, unless you mean to use it as a stick and nothing more." And he turned to find a broad man in a boiled leather jerkin standing close enough to gut him with the long skinning knife held loose and easy in one scarred hand. 3 others fanned out behind him, bows half drawn, watching Oliver with the particular flat suspicion Northmen reserved for anyone wearing a badge with towers on it, however threadbare and mud-stained that badge had become over the last month of travel. "We're not looking for trouble," Robb said. His voice had steadied over the weeks, thickened back into something like its old strength, though the fever had left a faint roughness in it that hadn't gone away. "We're looking for anyone still marching under a gray banner." The broad man's eyes flicked over him, the stick, the too thin frame under a cloak that had clearly belonged to someone else once, the crusted scar along one brow that pulled the eye it sat above into a permanent half-squint. Then his gaze moved past Robb's shoulder to Oliver and hardened considerably. "That one's wearing Frey colors under his cloak," the man said. "I can see the gray towers on his jerkin plain as day, boy. Don't think the cloak hides it. Give me one reason I shouldn't gut a Frey where he stands. After what his house did to men, I called friends not 2 months gone, because I'm the reason he's not dead already," Robb said, before Oliver could answer for himself, and something in the flatness of his own voice surprised him even as he said it, not pleading, not explaining, simply a statement of fact delivered the way a man states the weather. "And because if you kill him, you'll never learn what he did to get me out of that hall alive, and I think, once you know it, you'll want him walking free a good deal more than you want him dead." That got their attention properly. The broad man's knife didn't lower, but his eyes narrowed on Robb now instead, taking in the scar, the stick, the way he stood, favoring his right side still, weight kept careful and even, the stance of a man who'd learned very recently and very painfully what it cost to move wrong. "Who in 7 hells are you," the man said, "that a Frey owes you his life instead of the other way round?" "Torrin Little," said one of the men behind him, low before Robb could answer, a lean older man with a gray-streaked beard, staring now at Robb's face with an expression sliding rapidly from suspicion into something like disbelief. "Look at him. Look at the eyes, man. I've stood guard outside that face 100 nights on the march south." Torrin Little, the broad man, evidently looked again, and this time Robb watched the recognition land on him like a physical blow, watched the knife hand drop an inch, watched the color actually leave the man's weathered face. "That's not possible," Little said, very quietly. "You're dead. Every man in the Riverlands knows the king in the North's dead, cut down at that cursed wedding along with his lady mother and half the men who marched with him. Every man in the Riverlands is wrong," Robb said, "which is precisely the advantage I intend to make use of, and precisely why I need to know I can trust the 4 of you not to go running off to sell that piece of news to the first Bolton patrol you meet for a fat purse and a pat on the head." The lean older man, the one who'd recognized him, dropped to one knee in the mud without a word, and after a moment's hesitation, so did the other 2 bowmen. Torrin Little stood a moment longer, knife still loose in his hand, studying Robb's face with the particular hard scrutiny of a man who has been burned once by hope already, and has no intention of being burned again. "If you're lying to me," Little said at last, "if you're some Lannister trick, some Bolton man playing dress-up to draw out what's left of us so they can finish the job properly, I'll kill you myself and count it a mercy for the men who'd have followed you to their graves a second time believing it was really you." "I'd expect nothing less," Robb said. "Ask me something only Robb Stark would know. I'll answer, and then you can decide." Little thought a moment, then said, "Great Jon Umber lost 2 fingers to frostbite marching south with you. Which hand?" "His left," Robb answered at once. He told every man in earshot for a week afterward that it was a fair trade, since he'd never needed more than 8 fingers to hold an axe properly, and the extra 2 had only ever been good for counting past 10, which he said he'd no cause to do since he couldn't count that high to begin with. He allowed himself the ghost of a smile at the memory, the Great John's booming laugh, the way the whole camp had roared along with him even in the worst of that terrible winter march. "He's dead now, I expect." I haven't heard different and I've asked. Little's jaw worked. Slowly he sheathed the knife, and slowly, stiffly, as though the joints of his own legs were fighting the decision, he knelt as well. "Aye," he said, voice rough. "That's him. That's the great Jon's own joke, word for word. I heard him tell it myself a dozen times on the march and never once got tired of it." He looked up, and there was something raw and unguarded in the look now, something that had been sealed away tight since the wedding and was cracking open despite every instinct telling him not to let it. "We thought you were gone, my lord. We thought it was all for nothing, the marching, the fighting, the men we buried at the Green Fork and the Whispering Wood. We've been 3 weeks in these woods arguing amongst ourselves whether to go home to our clans or try to break through to Riverrun or just lay down and die where we stood, and not one of us could agree, because there wasn't a king left to tell us which." "There's a king left," Robb said, and reached down to grip the man's shoulder, pulling him back up onto his feet rather than let him kneel in the mud a moment longer. "And I mean to give you something a great deal better to do than argue in these woods until winter kills you where you sit. How many men are with you?" There were nearly 60 of them, scattered through half a mile of scrubby woodland along the riverbank in small groups of 4 and 5, hiding from Frey patrols and Bolton foragers alike, living on stolen grain and whatever game the mountain men among them could snare. They had been part of the host camped outside the twins' walls the night of the wedding, too many men to fit inside for the feast, left behind under half-hearted watch while their lords and captains went in to drink at Walder Frey's table, and when the screaming started and the gates were barred against them, they had done the only thing leaderless, frightened men in the dark could do. They had scattered, some fighting, most fleeing, all of them certain by morning that their king was dead and their war lost, and their only hope of seeing home again lay in becoming as small and forgettable as possible until the whole business blew over. Robb walked among them that evening as the light failed, Oliver trailing a careful half-step behind him, and watched face after face crumple through disbelief into something that looked almost like pain, the particular pain of hope returning to men who had worked very hard to kill it in themselves because hope, in the Riverlands that autumn, had become a luxury that got men killed faster than despair did. "You're truly alive," said a young archer, no older than 16, staring at Robb as though he might vanish if the boy blinked. We heard they cut Lady Catelyn's throat in front of everyone. We heard your wolf died screaming in the yard." "Both true," Robb said. He'd learned, over these 3 weeks of travel and disclosure, that there was no kindness in softening it, that the men who followed him deserved the truth delivered plainly rather than dressed up in comfortable lies. "My mother is dead. My wife is dead. My direwolf is dead. I am not dead, and I do not intend to spend what's left of my life pretending otherwise, hiding in ditches waiting for the Boltons to decide my fate for me. I mean to take back what's mine, and I mean to make every man who had a hand in that wedding answer for it, and I would very much like the company of men who feel the same, if such men still exist among you." There was a silence, and then, from somewhere in the gathered crowd, a low growl of a voice. An old soldier, scarred and gray, missing 3 fingers on his sword hand from some old wound, said, "I'll follow you into the 7 hells themselves if it means putting a blade through Walder Frey's rotten heart, my lord. Say the word and I'm yours again, same as I was before that wedding, same as I'll be till the day I die properly this time." The rest of them followed almost as one. Not every voice, not immediately. There were a handful of tired, wary men who hung back at the edges of the firelight and said nothing, and Robb noted them without judgment, understanding well enough by now what it cost a man to hope twice in one season. But by the time full dark had fallen over the riverbank, he had, for the first time since he'd woken bleeding onto a stranger's straw pallet, something that was not merely a memory of an army but the actual, breathing beginning of one. 61 hardened men, half of them mountain clansmen who knew this country better than any map Oliver could draw, all of them furious, all of them grieving, all of them looking to him now with the particular fierce hunger of men who had thought their cause already lost and had just been handed it back. It was not a kingdom. It was not even, yet, an army capable of taking a single walled town, but it was iron where an hour before there had only been ash. And Robb Stark stood in the firelight that night and felt, for the first time in weeks, something that was not grief and was not rage but was instead a cold, clean, purposeful calm, the feeling, he thought, of a man finally standing on solid ground after a long fall. 200 miles to the north, in the great hall of Winterfell that had stood empty and burned in one wing since the Ironborn's brief cruel occupation of it, Roose Bolton sat at the high table where the Starks had sat for 8,000 years, and read a letter for the third time with an expression that gave away absolutely nothing at all. Across the hall his bastard son leaned against a wall with his arms crossed, watching him with poorly concealed impatience. Ramsay had never learned patience, Roose reflected, not in all the years he'd tried to teach it to him, and it was one of several qualities that made the boy simultaneously useful and dangerous, a blade with no handle, all edge and no grip. "Well," Ramsay said, when the silence had stretched past what he could bear, "what's it say? Is it about Reek's little escape attempt again?" "Because I told you, father, that's been handled. It is not about your Reek," Roose said, in the mild flat voice he used for everything, whether he was discussing the weather or ordering a man's death, a voice that had unsettled harder men than his son long before Ramsay was ever born. "It concerns a wolf." "We killed the wolf," Ramsay said, brightening slightly at the memory, the way he always brightened at memories of killing things. "Chained him in the yard myself, watched him take 3 crossbow bolts before he even went down properly. Ugly great brute. Took his hide as a trophy, though the taxidermist made rather a poor job of the— Not that wolf," Roose said. "This letter is from Sir Damon. He writes that in the villages south of the Twins, along the riverbank, there's talk among the small folk of a gray wolf seen moving through the woods at night. Not a dire wolf, an ordinary wolf, but the small folk are calling it a ghost regardless, saying it walks where the king's own beast used to walk, saying it's a sign the young wolf isn't as dead as we've told them he is." He set the letter down, folded his long pale hands atop it, and looked at Ramsay with an expression of perfect, unhurried calm that Ramsay, who had learned over many years to read the small signs beneath his father's stillness, recognized immediately as far more alarming than any shout would have been. "Peasant talk of ghost wolves is not in itself of any great concern to me. Peasants have always told each other stories to fill the long nights. What concerns me is that Sir Damon also writes that when his men searched the Twins' godswood, where the bodies of the slain were finally cleared away and buried 3 days after the wedding, a delay for which Lord Walder should by rights answer, though that's a separate matter, they found fewer bodies than they had counted men dead in that hall on the night itself." Ramsay's grin faltered slightly, which was, for him, a rare and telling thing. "How many fewer?" "1," Roose said, "precisely 1. The silence that followed had weight to it. "You think the boy's alive?" Ramsay said finally, and there was, beneath the incredulity, something else in his voice that Roose recognized and did not entirely trust, a flicker of pure delight at the idea of a hunt, of prey worth the chasing, the same delight he took in his hounds and his flaying knife and every other cruelty that made him who he was. "I think," Roose said, with the precision of a man laying out figures on a ledger, "that a battlefield in chaos, with 40 men dead in a small space in the space of a few minutes, is exactly the sort of place where a count might go astray by 1, through simple human error, and that it would be foolish and premature to build any great alarm upon so slender a foundation. He paused. I also think that Robb Stark was, whatever else one says of him, a young man of considerable resourcefulness, who survived a war his father's death should by all reasonable measure have ended, and that resourceful young men have an unfortunate habit of surviving things that ought to have killed them, right up until the moment they finally don't. I have not become Warden of the North by assuming the convenient outcome is always the true one, Ramsay. I intend to find out quietly, without alarming anyone, precisely what happened to that one missing body, before I permit myself to sleep easy in this hall that men might yet say does not truly belong to me. And if he is alive, Ramsay asked, if the wolf really is walking? Roose considered this for a long moment, his pale eyes fixed on nothing in particular, the fire in the great hearth throwing shifting light across a face that revealed, as always, exactly as much as its owner intended it to reveal, which was to say nothing at all. Then we shall have to kill him properly this time, he said. And I confess I would find that regrettable, in a purely practical sense. A second death is always messier and more expensive than a first would have been, and there is a limit to how many times a great house can be reported dead before even the small folk begin to grow suspicious of the pattern. But regrettable is not the same as impossible, Ramsay, and if the boy has truly slipped through our fingers once, I would rather learn of it now, while he is weak and friendless and hunted, than learn of it a year from now when he has had time to gather an army around that pretty crown of his again. He rose from the high seat, the Stark seat, carved with direwolves that Roose had, out of a certain dry practicality rather than any respect, not bothered to have removed, and looked down the length of the hall at the fire, the banners, the great stone walls that had belonged to Starks for 8,000 years and now, provisionally, uncertainly, belonged to him. Send word to Sir Damon, double the men searching the riverbank south of the Twins, and send a raven to Lord Frey, quietly, mind, not in a manner that suggests panic, merely diligence, informing him that I require a precise accounting, name by name, of every man known to have died in that hall, cross-referenced against every body actually recovered and buried. If there is a discrepancy larger than the one I already know of, I want to know its shape before anyone else in the Seven Kingdoms does. Robb learned, 3 days later, from a frightened peasant woman who traded them a sack of turnips for a silver stag and a promise not to burn her cottage, that Frey patrols along the riverbank had doubled in the last week, and that soldiers had been asking, very specifically, whether anyone had seen a gray wolf in the woods at night. They're not asking about wolves, he said, once the woman had hurried off, clutching her coin and refusing to meet anyone's eyes a moment longer than necessary. They're asking about me. Someone's counted the bodies and come up short. Torrin Little, crouched by the fire turning a spit of stolen rabbit, didn't look up. How long before they work out who's missing? Not long, Robb said. Roose Bolton isn't a fool, whatever else he is. If he's counting bodies, he's already thought of the possibility that I'm alive, or he wouldn't be counting at all. The question isn't whether he'll suspect it. The question is how much time we have before suspicion turns into certainty, and how much use I can make of that time before it runs out. Then we should move, Little said. Get you somewhere properly defended, Riverrun, if we can break through, or up into the mountains with my own people, where no Bolton patrols ever managed to follow a Little who didn't want to be followed. Number, Robb said it quietly, but with enough weight that Little finally looked up from the fire. If I run and hide until I'm strong again, Bolton has months to consolidate the North behind him, months to make every lord who might otherwise remember his oaths to House Stark decide that a live Bolton bird in the hand is worth more than a dead Stark wolf in the bush. Every week I spend hiding is a week he spends making my return matter less. I don't have the luxury of patience, little. I have the advantage of surprise, and surprise is a coin that gets spent the moment it's used. I intend to use it while it's still worth spending, not hoard it until it's gone stale. Use it how, my lord? This from the young archer Cregan, who had attached himself to Robb's company with the particular devoted intensity of a boy who has just watched his king rise from the dead and cannot quite stop staring at the fact of it. 60 men can't take a castle. 60 men don't need to take a castle, Robb said. 60 men need to make Roose Bolton's grip on this river look a great deal less certain than he's telling Tywin Lannister it is. There's a Frey supply column due through the crossing 3 miles east of here in 2 days' time. Grain and steel bound for the siege lines at Riverrun, according to the good woman who just sold us her turnips, and, apparently, her husband's loose tongue along with them. If that column doesn't arrive, the men besieging my uncle's castle go hungry a while longer, and Roose Bolton has to explain to Lord Tywin why his supply lines aren't as safe as he promised. More than that, he looked around the fire at the ring of hard, weathered faces watching him, waiting, believing in him in a way he had almost forgotten men were still capable of believing in anyone. Every man in that column who survives to talk about it will go home telling a story about gray wolves in the dark, about the young wolf's ghost striking where no living army could reach. I want that story spreading through every village and every barracks between here and Winterfell, faster than any raven could carry it. I want Roose Bolton to lie awake at night wondering not whether I'm alive, but how many of me there are, and where I'll strike next, and whether the men he's counting on to hold the north for him are starting to whisper that maybe, just maybe, the old king isn't done yet. Little studied him a long moment across the fire, and something shifted in the old clansman's weathered face. Respect, Robb thought, though it was tangled up with something wearier and sadder too, the recognition of a boy he'd once followed south to war becoming, in the space of a single terrible autumn, something else entirely. Your father would have hated this, Little said finally, not unkindly. Fighting from the shadows, striking at supply carts instead of meeting a man honestly on an open field. My father is dead, Robb said, and there was no bitterness in it, only fact, the same flat, weary fact he'd been carrying since Ned Stark's head came off on the steps of a sept in a city he'd never even wanted to visit. My father died an honest death, fighting honestly, trusting men who swore him honest oaths, and it got him killed regardless, because honest men lose to men willing to break every oath they've ever sworn, every single time, unless the honest men learn to fight a little less honestly themselves. I loved my father, Little. I loved everything he taught me, but I am done losing wars because I was too proud to fight them the way they actually need fighting. And if that means striking from the shadows at grain carts instead of meeting Roose Bolton on some open field where he'd have every advantage of position and numbers, then that is exactly what I intend to do, and I'll answer to the gods for it gladly, so long as it means the men who murdered my mother and my wife and my unborn child eventually answer to me. No one spoke for a long moment after that. The fire cracked and settled. Somewhere off in the dark trees an owl called once and was answered. Little said at last, quiet. Well, I never said it was the wrong way to fight, my lord, only that it wasn't your father's way. He reached over and speared another piece of rabbit off the spit, held it out toward Robb almost like an offering. Your father's dead, like you say. Maybe it's past time we started fighting like a king who means to live. The ambush, when it came, was neither elegant nor merciful, and Robb had expected neither of those things going into it. They took the supply column at the ford 3 miles east, where the road narrowed between a stand of alder trees and the riverbank itself, forcing the carts to slow to single file. Olivar's information, gleaned from a lifetime of knowing exactly how his father's men moved supplies along roads his father's men had used for generations, proving more valuable with every passing day. 20 Frey soldiers guarded a train of 12 carts, more than enough men to see off bandits, nowhere near enough to withstand 60 furious Northmen who knew the ground and had chosen the moment and the place with care. Robb led the charge himself on a borrowed horse, with a sword Torrin Little had produced from somewhere stolen likely, though Robb didn't ask, and the fighting was brief, brutal, and entirely one-sided. He killed 2 men himself in the space of perhaps a minute, and felt, in the doing of it, none of the reluctance that had haunted his first battles years before. None of the sick lurch in his stomach that had come after the whispering wood when he'd first understood in his body what it meant to end another man's life. There was only the cold, clean purpose that had been building in him since he woke on that straw pallet, and when it was done, when the last of the Frey guardsmen had thrown down his sword and begged for mercy on his knees in the mud, Robb stood over him with his sword still wet and felt nothing at all except a kind of grim, exhausted satisfaction. "Please," the guardsman said, a young man, younger than Robb himself, face white with terror. "Please, my lord, I've a wife, a daughter not 2 years old. I never wanted any part of what happened at that wedding. I was posted to the walls that night. I never even—" "Were you at the wedding?" Robb asked. "No, my lord, I swear it. I was on watch outside. I never—" "Then get up," Robb said, "and go home to your wife and your daughter, and tell every man you meet on the way that the king in the north is not so dead as Lord Walder and Lord Bolton would have you believe, and that he does not make war on frightened men who had no hand in what happened at that table. But tell them also—" He leaned down, close enough that the terrified young guardsman could see the scar through his eyebrow, the strange half-squint of the eye that hadn't fully healed right, close enough to make sure the words landed with their full weight. "Tell them that every man who did have a hand in it, every man who planned it and smiled through it and drank wine while my mother's blood was still wet on the floor, is going to learn precisely how much of a mistake he made. And that I have all the time in the world now to make sure of it, because dead men, it turns out, are very difficult to kill twice." The young soldier fled on foot into the trees without looking back, and Robb watched him go, and felt Olivar's eyes on him from where the boy sat his own horse a little apart from the fighting, watching with an expression that had grown steadily more complicated over the past 3 weeks, admiration and something that looked almost like grief for the boy king he remembered from a gentler season of this war, watching him become something else entirely in front of his eyes. "You let him go," Olivar said, when the wagons had been stripped of anything useful and set to the torch, when the Northmen were already dispersing back into the trees in small groups, the way Torrin Little had taught them, so that no single trail could be followed back to any single camp. "I told you I know the difference," Robb said. "That soldier will spread the story faster and better than any deliberate rumor I could plant myself, because frightened men who have been shown unexpected mercy talk more than frightened men who have simply been beaten. Fear alone makes men go quiet and hide. Fear mixed with mercy makes men need to tell someone what happened to them, because it doesn't fit the shape of the story they expected. By the time that boys finished telling this tale in every tavern between here and the Twins, half the North will believe I've got an army of ghosts 300 strong hiding in every wood between the Trident and the Neck." He looked at the burning wagons, the flames climbing high and orange against the darkening sky, sending a column of smoke up that would be visible for miles, that would be reported to Roose Bolton within days as one more piece of evidence in the case he was quietly, carefully building against the possibility of a dead king walking. "Let them wonder how many of me there are, Olivar. Let Roose Bolton spend his winter chasing shadows instead of consolidating his hold on lords who are still deciding whether to trust him. Every day he spends hunting ghosts is a day he isn't spending making himself unkillable, and I intend to make very good use of every one of those days before this is finished. They rode through the night to put distance between themselves and the burning wagons, and somewhere past midnight, when the company had finally stopped to rest in a hollow well back from any road, Robb found himself sitting a little apart from the fire, alone with the ache in his side that the ride had reawakened, and the deeper ache that never fully slept, and Oliver came and sat beside him without being asked, the way he'd taken to doing most nights since the croft, as though he'd appointed himself some unofficial keeper of whatever remained of the man Robb had been before all of this. "You frightened that soldier half to death," Oliver said quietly. "I saw his face. He'll have nightmares about you for the rest of his life." "Good," Robb said, and then, more honestly after a moment, "I don't know if that's good. I don't know any more what good even means in a war like this one. I only know it's useful, and I've stopped being able to tell the difference between the two things as clearly as I used to." Oliver was quiet a while, watching the small, distant glow of the campfire, the shapes of 60 tired men settling in for what little sleep the night would allow them. "For what it's worth," he said at last, "I don't think you've become a monster, my lord, whatever you might be telling yourself in the dark hours. A monster wouldn't have let that boy go home to his daughter. A monster wouldn't still be keeping that hour of grief every night. Even now, even with all of this, I've seen you do it. You know, you think I don't notice, but I do." He glanced sideways, something careful and searching in his expression. "I think you're becoming exactly what this war made necessary, and I think there's a difference between that and becoming something you'll hate yourself for afterward. But I also think you should know that difference matters to me, watching you, more than you probably realize. I didn't drag you out of that hall to help build another Roose Bolton. I did it because I believed, I still believe, that there's something in you worth saving that isn't just useful. I'd like to still believe that when all of this is finally over." Robb looked at him for a long moment, this strange, unlikely companion, this Frey who had broken every oath his house had ever sworn in order to keep one small private oath of his own, this boy who had somehow become, in the space of a single terrible month, the closest thing Robb had left in the world to a friend who'd known him before the crown, before the crossbow bolt, before all of this, and found, to his own quiet surprise, that he believed him. "So do I," Robb said. "Some days more than others. Tonight mostly, thanks to you." He looked back toward the fire, toward the men who had, against every reasonable expectation, chosen to follow a dead man back into a war that had already cost them everything once. "Get some sleep, Oliver. Tomorrow we start looking for more men like Little's people. If I mean to do this properly, if I mean to take back what's mine and make Roose Bolton answer for what he's done, I'm going to need a great deal more than 60 men and a handful of stolen wagons. I'm going to need an army the North remembers how to be proud of again." Far to the north, in a hall built of stark stone under a Bolton banner, Roose Bolton read a raven's message about a burning supply column and a story already spreading through 3 villages about a king who would not stay dead, and set the letter down beside the others, and allowed himself, for the first time in a very long career built on patience and cold calculation, a small, thin frown. "He's alive," he said quietly to no one in the empty hall. "Of course he's alive. The gods have always had a rather cruel sense of humor where the Starks are concerned." He rose and called for Ramsay, and began, with the same meticulous care he brought to everything, to plan for a war he had thought was already won. Chapter 3. The wolf returns to Winterfell Oldcastle fell in the hour before dawn, which was, Robb had learned over the past 4 months of this quiet, grinding war, the hour when even the most disciplined watch grew careless, cold enough to make a man's attention wander toward thoughts of his own bed, dark enough that shapes moving along a wall could still be mistaken for shadow a moment or two longer than they should be. They went in over the eastern wall, where the stone had crumbled and never been properly repaired because Lord Locke had spent the silver that should have gone to his masons on something else entirely. Horses, mostly, fine ones. The kind a man bought when he wanted the North to notice he'd prospered under new masters. Torrin Little's mountain men went up first, quiet as cats, and by the time the alarm bell finally rang, cracked and frantic in the black cold, Robb's men already held the gatehouse and the armory both, and the fighting that followed in the yard was less a battle than a slow, methodical harvesting of men too confused and too outnumbered to mount anything like a real defense. Robb killed the castellan's second son himself, a boy of perhaps 17 who came at him with more courage than sense, swinging a blade he clearly hadn't trained with nearly enough. And it was over in 3 strokes, and Robb felt, as he had come to feel about all of it now, very little, a kind of distant professional regret, the way a man might regret breaking a good tool, rather than anything that touched him deeper than that. "That's the last of them in the yard, my lord," Cregan called, breathless, blood on his bow arm that didn't look like his own. Lord Locke's barred himself in the hall with what's left of his household guard. "Then we'll go and unbar it," Robb said, and did. Lord Bennet Locke was not, in the end, a difficult man to unbar a door from. 3 good blows from a borrowed war hammer against old northern oak did the work, and the household guard inside surrendered the moment the door gave, dropping swords they'd never truly believed would need using tonight. In a keep they'd all assumed sat safely enough behind Bolton's protection that no army would ever trouble it. Locke himself stood near the hearth in a fine fur-lined robe thrown hastily over a nightshirt, a heavy-set man going gray at the temples, and when he saw Robb's face in the torchlight, the scar through the brow, the half-squint of the ruined eye, the particular set of the jaw that half the North had once known from 100 war councils, something went out of him all at once, like a man watching the last coin drop from an already empty purse. "Gods," he said, "it's true, all the stories." I'm really," Robb said. "Sit down, Lord Locke. We've a great deal to discuss, and I'd rather not do it while you're deciding whether to reach for that dagger on your belt, because I promise you, you won't reach it in time. And I'd rather this conversation not end before it's begun." Locke sat slowly into the great chair by the hearth that had probably belonged to his father and his father's father before him, men who had held this keep loyally in House Stark's name for generations before one autumn's treachery had apparently persuaded Bennet Locke that loyalty was a coin best spent on whoever held the winning hand. "You hunted Bran," Robb said. There was no heat in his voice, not yet. He'd learned in these months that heat was wasted on men like this, that cold questions got truer answers than shouted ones. 2 years passed. When the Ironborn took Winterfell and my brothers fled north, you and your men rode with Ramsay Snow's hunting party, tracking 2 boys through the wolfswood like game. Locke's face went the color of old tallow. My lord, I was ordered. Lord Bolton commanded every house in the region to lend men to the search. We were told they were fugitives, Ironborn spies. We didn't know." "You knew," Robb said. "Everyone in the North knew whose sons those boys were. You knew, and you rode anyway, because Roose Bolton had already made himself lord of this land in all but name, and you wanted to be counted among the men who pleased him." He crouched, so that he and Locke were at eye level, close enough that the older man flinched back into the chair. "Did you find them?" "No," Locke said, and something in the way he said it, some small tremor of relief buried under the fear, told Robb the man was telling the truth. "No, my lord, they got away clean. Whatever the boy did, your brother, I mean, the crippled one. Gods know how a boy who can't walk outran mounted men through that country, but he did. and Ramsay was in a black fury about it for a week after. Robb felt something in his chest ease very slightly at that. A small, cold confirmation of the hope he'd been carrying since the croft, since he'd first told Oliver with more certainty than he had any right to that Bran wouldn't die in a burning tower. He said nothing of it aloud. He didn't owe this man the satisfaction of watching it land. "Here is what's going to happen," Robb said instead. "You're going to write out in your own hand every man in this castle and this village who rode with that hunting party, and everything you can remember of what Bolton ordered and why. You're going to write out every tax and every levy you've sent north since you swore to him instead of to House Stark. And then you and I are going to have a conversation about what happens to a lord who broke an oath to my father's house, hunted my crippled brother like a deer through the woods, and slept comfortably in this hall every night since believing himself entirely safe from any consequence at all." "Mercy," Locke said, and it came out cracked, undignified, the plea of a man who had clearly never expected to need to make it. "My lord, please, I've a wife, grandchildren. I never laid a hand on your brother. I never even came close." "You hunted him," Robb said, and here finally the cold in his voice found its edge. "A boy who cannot walk, who cannot run, who could do nothing but be dragged along by whoever loved him enough to carry him, and you rode after him with hounds and men and torches because you thought it might please the man who murdered my mother. I know the difference between men who had no choice and men who chose, Lord Locke. I have made a point of knowing that difference in every keep I've taken since I came back from the dead, and I promise you, you are very firmly on the wrong side of it." He stood and looked at Torrin Little, who was watching from the doorway with the particular flat patience of a man waiting for a verdict he already half expected. "Take him to the yard," Robb said. "Let every man and woman in this castle who remembers what House Locke did to their true lords watch him answer for it. Then see it done." They executed Bennett Locke an hour after dawn, in the yard where his own men had surrendered without a fight, and Robb watched it happen with an expression that gave nothing away, and told himself, as he had told himself after every execution these past months, that this was justice and not merely vengeance wearing justice's clothes, and was no longer entirely sure, in the privacy of his own skull, that the distinction still held together as cleanly as it once had. "You didn't have to watch," Oliver said later, as they rode away from Oldcastle with 36 new men in their train, small folk and disaffected household guards who'd thrown in with them the moment Locke's head came off, men who had apparently been waiting years for anyone, to give them permission to hate their lord as much as they already secretly did. "You could have let Little see it done and stayed in the hall going through the ledgers." "I know," Robb said. "So why didn't you?" Robb was quiet a long moment, watching the wolfswood pass on either side of the road, bare branches black against a sky the color of old iron. "Because I think if I ever stop making myself watch," he said finally, "I'll stop feeling anything about it at all, and I'm frightened of what I'll become the day that happens. My father used to say that the man who passes the sentence should swing the sword himself, so he knows exactly what he's ordered and never forgets the weight of it. I can't swing the sword every time anymore. There's too much war and not enough of me to do all of it myself, but I can at least make myself watch. It's the smallest discipline I have left, Oliver, and I think it might be the most important one." Oliver rode a while in silence, considering this. "Bennett Locke deserved to die," he said at last. "I'm not disputing that, not for a moment, not after what you told me he did. But I watched your face while it happened, my lord, and I didn't see a man who was troubled by it. I saw a man who's gotten used to it. That frightens me a little, if I'm honest with you, more than the execution itself did." "It frightens me too," Robb admitted, and the honesty of it cost him something to say. "I don't know how to fix that, though, or whether it can even be fixed anymore, or whether it should be. I only know I can't fight this war any other way and still win it. My mother believed in mercy her whole life, and mercy is a great part of why she's dead. She trusted a man's oath because breaking guest right was supposed to be unthinkable, and it turned out to be entirely thinkable to the right man with the right price on offer. I don't intend to make that mistake. If that means becoming a colder man than my father would recognize, then I suppose that's the price of coming back from the dead, and I'll pay it, because the alternative is dying a second time for real, and I've already decided I'd rather live with the weight of who I'm becoming than die clean and useless in a ditch somewhere. They rode on. Somewhere behind them, the smoke of old castles burned granary, set alight not out of cruelty but simple strategy, denying Bolton's forces a supply depot they'd relied on for 2 winters, smudged the gray sky. One more column to add to the dozen others that had begun, over these past months, to mark the map of the North like a slow accumulating bruise. 200 miles north, in a low stone hall at the Dreadfort that had none of Winterfell's grandeur and all of its owner's careful, patient chill, Roose Bolton sat across a small table from his son, and considered a letter he had received that morning with an expression of studied, deliberate calm. "Oldcastle's fallen," Ramsay said, not bothering to disguise his delight. "Locke's dead." His own small folk cheered while they took his head if this letter's to be believed. "That's the 9th keep in 4 months, father. 9, and every one of them a keep that swore to us." "I am aware of the arithmetic," Roose said. "I read the same letter you did. He's not hiding any more." Ramsay leaned forward, something bright and hungry in his pale eyes, the same look he got watching his hounds work. "He's not skulking through the woods, burning the odd supply cart and vanishing into the dark. He's taking castles now, executing lords in front of their own people, building an army out of every household guard and disgruntled small folk fool who's ever resented bending a knee to us. He means to come north eventually, father, to Winterfell, or wherever's left standing that still calls itself the seat of the North. He means to finish what he started before that wedding ever happened." "Yes," Roose agreed, in the same mild voice he used to discuss crop yields. "I imagine he does. Then why aren't you more concerned?" Ramsay's grin had thinned into something more genuinely puzzled. "He's not a ghost story anymore. He's a real army with a real grievance, and he's growing faster than we're managing to slow him down." Roose set the letter aside and folded his long, pale hands together on the table, the gesture he made when he wanted a conversation to feel considered rather than urgent, even when, as now, the matter beneath it was, in truth, extremely urgent. "I am concerned about a great many things, Ramsay," he said. "I am concerned that we no longer hold Winterfell, or the wardenship, or anything like the authority we held 2 years ago, because the lords of this North turned their backs on us, the moment your half-brother's bastard proved himself against the dead, and gave them a prettier banner to rally behind. I am concerned that King Jon Snow, and I confess it still tastes strange in my mouth, calling a bastard king, whatever he's earned it by, sits in Winterfell now with the love of every house that matters, and that if word of what happened at the Twins ever reaches his ears in any detail, he will have both the moral authority and the popular support to see us both hanged for it without a single lord in the North lifting a finger to stop him." "He already knows you were there," Ramsay said. "Everyone knows the Freys and the Boltons did for the young wolf between them. It's hardly a secret. Knowing the shape of a thing and knowing the particulars of it are very different matters," Roose said. "The North has been willing to overlook the shape of it because it ended the war, brought peace, put a Stark bannerman, even a bastard one, into Winterfell in the end. What the North has not yet heard, and what I am extremely determined it never does hear, is that I personally drove the dagger into Lady Catelyn Stark's throat while she begged for her son's life, or that her son did not, in fact, die that night at all, and that I have spent these last 4 months hunting a man I told the Iron Throne was safely dead, at considerable expense and considerable failure. He allowed himself a thin, humorless smile. If Robb Stark reaches Winterfell alive, Ramsay, and tells his brother, even his half-brother, even a bastard he barely knew growing up, exactly what happened in that hall, I do not believe there is a hound in your kennels loyal enough, or a flaying knife sharp enough, to save either of our necks from what follows. King Jon Snow may be a bastard born, but I am given to understand he loved his family rather fiercely, in the way men raised outside a family's warmth so often do, precisely because they know its value better than those born comfortably inside it. That is not a man I wish discovering, in detail, exactly how his mother died. Ramsay was quiet a moment, chewing on this with visibly less relish than he brought to most conversations. So what do? We do what careful men have always done when a dangerous truth is walking toward them faster than we can stop it, Roose said. We stop trying merely to slow him down, and we start trying to kill him properly, quietly, before he ever comes within 100 miles of Winterfell's gates. Take every man you can spare from the Dreadfort's garrison. Find him. And this time, Ramsay, I would very much appreciate it if you did not simply chain him in a yard and assume the matter settled. Confirm the kill yourself. Bring me something of his I can look at with my own eyes and know beyond any doubt that the matter is finally, truly closed. Ramsay's grin came back, slower this time, colder, more purely pleased than before. I'll bring you his head, father, I promise you that. Bring me proof, Roose said. I have very little use these days for promises. Winterfell's great hall had been rebuilt twice in the space of 5 years. Once after the Ironborn's brief, cruel occupation of it. Once after the fires of the battle for Winterfell, when the dead had come screaming out of the long night against walls that had, in the end, held, though at a cost the North would be counting for a generation. The scorch marks along the eastern wall had never quite scrubbed clean, no matter how many times the servants tried, and Jon Snow, king in the north, though the title still sat strangely on him some mornings, like a borrowed coat he hadn't yet grown fully into, had long since stopped asking them to keep trying. Some scars, he decided, were meant to stay visible. It kept a man honest about what it had cost to still be standing. He sat now not on any grand throne. There'd been talk, after the lords proclaimed him, of carving something suitably kingly, and Jon had refused it flatly, kept instead the plain high seat his father and Robb before him had used, direwolves worked into the arms, wood gone dark and smooth with generations of hands, and listened to Wyman Manderly recite grain counts from White Harbor with the particular glazed patience of a man who had learned, over 2 years of ruling, that half a king's true work was simply enduring meetings that would once have made him want to climb the nearest wall and never come down. And so, Your Grace, if the southern trade holds through the spring as Lord Tarley's letters suggest it might, White Harbor should be able to spare enough surplus to see the Umber lands through what's left of the winter stores without further strain. Manderly finished, mopping his considerable brow despite the hall's chill. Thank you, my lord, Jon said. Send my thanks to the fishing fleets as well. I know it's their backs breaking to fill those numbers. Beside him, in the smaller seat that had been added to the dais since her return from the Vale 2 winters past, Sansa Stark, Lady of Winterfell in all but formal title, since Jon had never once tried to claim the castle's true lordship for himself, insisting always that it belonged to Stark blood, and he was merely keeping it warm until proper Stark blood sat there again, leaned slightly toward him. There's a rider come in from the south, she murmured, low enough that Manderly, already shuffling toward the door with his ledgers, wouldn't overhear. From the Barrowlands, says he's got word for you personally, won't give it to anyone else. Jon felt the familiar small ache behind his eyes that came with most days lately. Not pain exactly, just the low hum of a man who had spent 5 years fighting things that should never have needed fighting, wights and wildlings, and his own family's ghosts all tangled together into one long, unbroken exhaustion he'd stopped expecting to end. Send him in. The rider was mud to the knees and had clearly not slept properly in days. A young man wearing the badge of a minor Barrowton household, one of the lesser lords who'd sworn to Jon after the war for the Dawn out of gratitude more than any deep loyalty, and he dropped to one knee in the rushes with the particular urgency of a man who'd ridden hard enough that his legs had nearly forgotten how to hold him upright. "Your Grace," he said. "There's fighting broke out across 3 keeps in the Barrowlands and the Riverlands border these past 4 months. Bennet Locke's dead, Oldcastle's fallen, burned in part, taken by force in the night. Before that, 2 Bolton-sworn holdfasts near the Weeping Water. There's a man leading it, Your Grace, some rebel captain the smallfolk have started calling." He hesitated, as though even repeating it felt strange in his own mouth. "Calling the Ghost King. Says he's taking castles house by house, executing any lord who swore to the Boltons after the Red Wedding, burning granaries, freeing prisoners. Some of the small folk swear he's got a wolf's face under that scar of his, that he can't be killed proper because he's died once already." Jon sat very still. Beside him, he felt rather than saw Sansa's whole body go rigid, her hands finding the arms of her chair and gripping them white-knuckled. "A rebel captain," Jon said slowly, keeping his voice carefully level, the tone he'd learned to use for every piece of news that might mean something enormous and might mean nothing at all, because a king who let every rumor show plainly on his face taught his enemies far too much about which rumors actually mattered. "Bandits, then. Outlaws using an old story to frighten superstitious men." "Might be, Your Grace," the rider said, "except, begging your pardon, but I thought you should hear it exact as it was told to me. One of Locke's own household guard, taken prisoner and let go after. This man swears the rebel captain has a scar through one brow, and one eye that sits wrong in the socket, like it healed crooked after a bad wound. And he swears, Your Grace, he swears the man fought with a longsword in a style he'd only ever seen once before, years back, watching the old king in the North train in the yard at Riverrun, before the Red Wedding took him. Said it was uncanny. Said he'd have sworn on his own mother's grave it was the same man come back, if he didn't know better." The hall had gone very quiet. Somewhere above, in the rafters where the old raven cages hung, a bird shifted and called once, a harsh, dry sound that seemed, in that silence, unnaturally loud. Jon did not move. He had learned, across a war against the dead themselves, across a lifetime of losses that had started with his father's head coming off on southern steppes and had simply never stopped accumulating since, how to receive terrible, impossible news without letting his face show the ground shifting under him. But something in his chest, something old, something he'd buried very deep the day word reached the wall that his brother and his lady mother had been butchered at a wedding feast, something he had grieved properly, thoroughly, and thought himself finished grieving, cracked open now like ice giving way beneath a boot, sudden and complete and terrifying, and how much still lay beneath it unhealed. "Leave us," he said to the rider, and then more gently, "You've ridden hard and well. See the kitchens feed you properly, and rest. I'll want to speak with you again before you return south." When the hall had cleared of everyone but Sansa and the guards at the far doors who stood too distant to hear, Jon finally let himself turn to her and found her already staring at him, blue eyes bright and wet and fierce all at once. "It can't be," she said. Her voice shook just slightly, the careful court composure she'd spent years building cracking along with his own. "Jon, it can't be him. We had word, everyone had word, the Freys themselves confirmed it, Lord Bolton confirmed it to father, I mean to Tywin Lannister, I mean." She stopped, pressed a hand to her mouth for a moment, steadying herself with visible effort. I buried him, Jon. In my heart. I buried Mother and Robb both, the same season, and it took me 2 years to stop waking up some mornings forgetting they were gone. I don't know if I can survive being told it might not be true and then finding out it was cruelty after all, some Bolton trick, some pretender wearing a scar to trouble us. I know, Jon said quietly. I don't know either, Sansa. I want it to be true so badly it frightens me, and that frightens me more than the possibility it's a lie, because I know exactly what kind of fool hope makes of a man who wants something enough. He looked toward the high windows, toward the gray northern sky beyond them, toward the south, toward the riverlands where, if the writer's story held even a grain of truth, his brother might be riding at that very moment through a war Jon had thought long over. But I'll tell you what I do know. If it is Robb, if he truly survived that wedding and has been fighting alone in the riverlands for 4 months without a single word reaching us, without asking for a single man or a single coin of the help I could have sent him, then he has questions for me that I am not entirely certain I know how to answer. He left this kingdom a king, Sansa. And whatever's true or false in that writer's story, I am the one sitting in Winterfell's high seat now, wearing a crown the lords gave me in his memory, ruling a north that has already, in his absence, chosen someone else. Sansa was quiet a long moment, watching him with an expression that held love and fear and something else besides, something that looked almost like foreboding. He won't kneel to you, she said finally, very softly. Whatever else is true about him now, whatever 4 months of secret war has made of him, Jon, you know our brother. You know what kind of pride runs in Robb, the kind that got him crowned king in the first place, the kind that marched an army south rather than accept anyone else's authority over the north. If he's alive, and if he learns you're sitting where he used to sit, he will not simply thank the gods for a miracle and bend the knee. He'll see a rival. He'll see a crown taken, even if none of us ever meant to take it from him. And I don't know what happens then between the two of you, and it terrifies me more than any dead man ever did, because I already lost one brother to a war I couldn't stop. I don't think I can survive losing another to one I helped start simply by letting you keep his throne warm. Jon said nothing for a long while. Outside, snow had begun again, fine and quiet, drifting past the high windows the way it always did this far north, indifferent to kings and wars and brothers both. Send riders south, he said finally. Quietly, I don't want this becoming a court rumor before I know what I'm dealing with. I want to know everything that's happened in the Riverlands these past 4 months, every keep taken, every name of every man who's fought beside this ghost king, before I decide what to do about it. He rose from the high seat, slow, the weight of 5 years of war settling into his bones the way it always did when the day's business finally stopped and left him alone with his own thoughts. And Sansa, if it is him. If by some mercy of the old gods and the new my brother truly survived that wedding and has been fighting his way back to us this whole time, I want to be the one who rides out to meet him. Not send men, not send ravens with careful diplomatic language some Meister drafted to spare my dignity. I want to look him in the face myself, brother to brother, before crowns or claims or any of the rest of it comes into it. Whatever he's become out there, whatever this war's cost him, he's still my brother. I owe him that much, at least, before anything else gets decided between us. Bran found him an hour later in the godswood, beneath the same great heart tree their father had prayed under a lifetime ago, sitting in the wheeled chair that had carried him faithfully these past years, his pale eyes distant in the particular way they sometimes went now, the way that still, even after everything, made something in Jon's chest go quietly cold with old unease. You already knew, Jon said. It wasn't quite a question. I've seen pieces, Bran said. His voice had a strange flatness to it these days, a careful distance, as though some part of him had gone somewhere else and only reluctantly kept a foothold in the world of ordinary men. Not all of it, not clearly. The visions don't work the way you'd wish they did, Jon. I don't get to choose what I see or when, and I don't always understand what I'm seeing even after I've seen it. But I've seen a wolf that isn't gray wind moving through burning woods. I've seen Robb's face, older, harder, doing things our father would have grieved to watch him do. He looked up, and for a moment something almost human, almost like grief, moved behind those distant eyes. I didn't tell you because I wasn't certain, and because some things are crueler to hope for than to grieve properly and be done with. I'm sorry, Jon. I should have told you sooner. I think he's going to need you to understand what he's become before you can hope to talk to him about anything at all. And I don't think that's going to be easy for either of you. Jon looked down at his younger brother. Not so young anymore. Not really. Not after everything the war and the visions had cost him. And felt, beneath the fear and the grief and the fierce, unreasonable hope, a deep and simple gratitude that at least this much of his family had come home to him whole, or as whole as any of them were likely to manage after everything the world had done to the Starks of Winterfell. Then I suppose I'd better go and find out, Jon said, before he decides to come and find me first, and gives neither of us the chance to choose how that meeting happens. Chapter 4. Brothers of different wars, the riverland smelled of char long before Jon Snow's party reached the village where Robb Stark was said to be holding court. It came to them on the wind 2 miles out, the particular acrid sweetness of burned grain mixed with something worse underneath. And Jon rode the last stretch with his jaw set, and his eyes moving constantly over the tree line, old habits from the wall reasserting themselves without his asking them to. Beside him, Tormund Giantsbane, who had insisted on coming south with a dozen of his own free folk, rather than let Jon ride into unknown country with only a Winterfell honor guard for company, scanned the woods with the same wary attention, one hand resting easy on the haft of the axe across his saddle. "You've gone quiet, Crow King," Tormund said. "Quieter than usual, and that's saying something, since you're not exactly a man who fills a silence at the best of times." "I don't know what I'm riding into," Jon said. "Every report says something different. One village swears he's a devil who burns anyone who ever bent a knee to Bolton. The next swears he fed their whole town through the winter out of captured Frey grain stores, and never asked for a coin of tribute in return. I can't tell which parts are true, and which parts are just fear finding a story to hold onto." "Maybe both," Tormund said. "Men aren't one thing, boy. I've known killers who wept over dead lambs and gentle men who'd cut your throat without blinking if the wind blew wrong that day. Sounds like your brother's had a hard enough winter to be a bit of both himself." They found the village, a huddle of a dozen buildings that had once belonged to some minor Bolton-sworn holdfast, its wooden palisade half-burned and hastily patched, with Stark banners flying from what remained of the gatehouse, gray direwolves on white that hadn't flown openly in the riverlands since the Red Wedding. Men in mismatched armor stood watch along the walls, hard-eyed and alert, and Jon felt the weight of their attention the moment his party came into view, felt the way word rippled ahead of them into the village itself, felt, more than anything, the strange vertigo of approaching a place his own brother supposedly ruled like something out of an old story everyone had assumed long finished. A rider came out to meet them before they reached the gate, young, dark-haired, wearing a badge Jon didn't recognize, though something in the boy's bearing suggested Frey blood even before he spoke. "State your business," the boy said, though his eyes had already gone wide, flicking between the stark gray Jon's small party wore and the black of his cloak, doing some quick uneasy arithmetic that clearly wasn't landing anywhere comfortable. "Tell your king," Jon said, and the word came out stranger in his mouth than he'd expected, that Jon Snow's come to see his brother. The boy's face went through several expressions in quick succession: shock, then something that looked almost like relief, then a wary caution that settled over the rest like a mask being fitted. "Wait here," he said, and wheeled his horse back through the gate at a gallop. They waited perhaps a quarter hour, long enough that Jon's escort grew restless, long enough that he himself began to wonder if this was some elaborate trap, some Bolton scheme to lure a second Stark to slaughter where the first had failed. Then the gates opened properly, and Jon saw him. He almost didn't recognize the shape of him at first. Thinner than the boy Jon remembered from Winterfell's yard, harder in the jaw, a scar cutting through one eyebrow that pulled the eye beneath it into a permanent, unsettling half-squint. Robb Stark walked out through his own gate on foot, no crown on his head, no fine cloak, just plain leather and mail that had seen hard use, a longsword at his hip that Jon didn't recognize either. But the eyes, when they finally fixed on Jon's face across the muddy space between them, were the same eyes Jon remembered from 100 childhood mornings in Winterfell's yard, tully blue, fierce, and for one unguarded moment, achingly glad. Neither of them moved for a long breath. Then Robb crossed the distance in 3 long strides and pulled Jon into an embrace so sudden and so hard it drove the air from Jon's lungs. And Jon felt something in his own chest crack wide open. 5 years of careful control simply giving way all at once. And he gripped his brother back just as hard, feeling the too thin frame beneath the mail, feeling him shaking, actually shaking, and understanding only slowly that some of the wetness against his own shoulder was Robb's tears, and some of it, he realized with faint surprise, was his own. "You're alive," Jon said, muffled into his brother's shoulder. "Gods, Robb, they told us. Everyone told us." "I know what they told you," Robb said, voice rough. "I know exactly what they told everyone because I let them keep believing it as long as it served me. I'm sorry, Jon. I should have sent word the moment I could ride. I should have." He pulled back, held Jon at arm's length, studying his face the way a man studies something he's afraid might vanish if he looks away too soon. "Gods, look at you. A crown. They put a crown on you." Something flickered behind his eyes then, something Jon couldn't quite read, gone as quickly as it came. "I heard. Even out here, even hiding in ditches for months, I heard. King Jon Snow, king in the north." A small, strange laugh, not entirely steady. "Father would have had something to say about that, I expect. Father would have said a great many things about a great many parts of these last 5 years. Jon said carefully, watching his brother's face, feeling the ground beneath this reunion shift subtly the moment the word crown had entered it. "None of it was my choosing, Robb. I want you to know that before anything else gets said between us. I never asked for it. I refused it twice before the Lords wore me down, and I've spent every day since wondering whether I did right by taking it at all." "I believe you," Robb said, and Jon thought he meant it, at least in that moment, standing in the mud with his brother's hands still gripping his shoulders as though letting go might undo the whole impossible fact of this reunion. "Come inside. Get out of that cloak, it's soaked through. We've a great deal to talk about, and I'd rather not do it standing in a gateway where every man on this wall can watch us decide how to feel about each other." Inside, in what had once been the holdfast small hall, Robb's men had laid out a meal that was, by the standards of the Riverlands that autumn, almost extravagant roast fowl, fresh bread, wine that had clearly been liberated from some Bolton-sworn lord's cellar. Jon noticed, without meaning to catalog it, the way every man in that hall watched Robb rather than him, the particular fierce loyalty in their faces, the way Torrin Little stood near the door with his arms crossed, watching Jon with open, unhidden suspicion that no amount of shared blood seemed likely to soften quickly. "Your men don't trust me," Jon observed, once the servants had cleared out and left the brothers alone with a jug of wine neither had yet touched. "My men have learned to trust very few people in this world," Robb said. "It's kept them alive. Don't take it personally." He poured 2 cups, pushed one across the table, and studied Jon for a long moment before he spoke again. "Tell me about Bolton, all of it. What the North knows, what you've done about it. Why the man who murdered my mother and drove me to a supposed grave is still breathing and holding lands in the North instead of hanging from Winterfell's walls." Jon set his cup down without drinking. This was, he understood, the true beginning of the conversation he'd ridden south to have, the one every polite exchange before it had only been circling. "When the war for the Dawn ended," he said, "the North was broken, Robb. Half the great houses had lost their fighting men to the dead. Winterfell itself was in ruins. There was no army left capable of marching on the Dreadfort, let alone besieging it properly. And Bolton had made himself useful in ways I couldn't simply ignore. He'd held the North's administration together through the worst of it, kept grain moving, kept the roads passable, done the grinding, unglamorous work that actually kept people alive through a winter that had already tried to kill every living thing north of the Neck. I didn't forgive him, Robb. I want you to understand that clearly. But I judged, rightly or wrongly, and I've asked myself which of those it was more nights than I can count, that a war against Bolton in that moment would have finished what the dead started, and killed more good Northmen than it would ever have avenged. So you let him keep his lands, his title, his life." Robb's voice had gone very flat, very careful, the tone Jon remembered from war councils years ago, the tone that meant his brother was working hard to keep something enormous contained behind a calm face. "I let him keep breathing because the North needed to keep breathing more," Jon said. "I never trusted him. I've had men watching him since the day I took this crown. But Robb, I was told you were dead. Everyone was told you were dead, and grief does strange things to a man's priorities. I spent that first year mourning you and Mother both, and trying to hold together a kingdom the dead had nearly finished burying. And somewhere in the middle of that, yes, I made a cold, practical peace with the man who'd murdered our mother, because the alternative was watching more of our people starve or freeze, while I chased vengeance I told myself would have to wait." "It waited 4 years," Robb said. "It waited long enough for him to become Warden of the North in truth, long enough for lords across this whole kingdom to start thinking of him as simply another great lord, one more name on one more banner, instead of the man who put a dagger in our mother's throat, while she begged him to spare her son's life." His hand had tightened around the wine cup hard enough that his knuckles had gone white. "I've spent 4 months burning his garrisons out of every keep between here and the Trident, Jon. 4 months, 60 men to start with and near 400 now, taking castles in the dark and executing every lord who swore to him after the wedding. And do you know what I keep hearing from every man and woman I free? I keep hearing that they'd given up hoping anyone would ever come for justice, that they'd made their peace with living under the man who murdered their king, because the king they'd loved was dead, and the king who replaced him had decided Bolton was too useful to touch." The accusation sat there in the space between them, unmistakable despite the careful, restrained way Robb had delivered it, and Jon felt his own temper rise to meet it before he could stop it. "You think I didn't want him dead," Jon said. "You think I haven't lain awake more nights than I could count, imagining exactly what I'd do to that man if I ever had him alone in a room. I was 15 when they sent me to the wall, Robb. I barely knew our mother the way you did, and even I wanted to burn the Dreadfort to the ground the moment I heard what he'd done. But I had a kingdom to hold together with too few men and too little grain, and an enemy behind the wall that made every southern grievance look small by comparison. I made the choice a king has to make sometimes, which is choosing the living over the dead, even when the dead deserve better than being set aside. I'm not going to apologize to you for keeping the North breathing while you were gone, Robb. I did the best I could with what I had, and what I had was very little, and I would make the same choice again tomorrow if it meant keeping thousands of people alive through another winter. Robb was quiet a long moment, and Jon watched something in his brother's face working through anger toward something more complicated, not agreement, not quite, but a grudging, painful recognition. "I'm not asking you to apologize," Robb said finally, more quietly. "I know what it is to hold a kingdom together with too little of everything and too many enemies. I know exactly what that costs a man, Jon, better than almost anyone alive. I'm only telling you what it did to the people who trusted House Stark to protect them, watching that man keep his lands. I'm telling you what 4 months of freeing his prisoners has taught me about how much fear he's built in this north while everyone believed the reckoning was finished." He set down his cup, finally, and met Jon's eyes directly. "But that's done now. That's why I'm here, and why I'm not stopping at the Trident. I mean to finish what that wedding started, Jon. I mean to take every last thing Bolton's built for himself and burn it to the ground. And I mean to put his head on a spike above whatever gate he dies defending. I would very much like to do that with my brother beside me rather than against me. But I need to know right now, before this goes any further between us, whether that's something you're prepared to help me do, or whether you mean to defend the peace you built with him instead." Jon felt the true shape of the conversation finally surface, the thing beneath the thing, and understood that everything that came after this moment would depend on how carefully he answered it. "I have no love for Roose Bolton," he said. "None. If you march on the Dreadfort, I won't stand in your way, and if you'll have me, I'll bring men to help you tear it down stone by stone." He paused. "But I want to know something in return, Robb, and I want an honest answer, because I think we both know there's a second question sitting underneath the first one, and I'd rather have it out now than let it fester between us while men are dying over it. What happens after? When Bolton's dead and his lands are ash, what then? Because right now there are 2 Stark banners flying in this kingdom, and 2 men the North is starting to whisper might both be called king, and that is not a situation that ends well for anyone, least of all for the people we're both supposedly fighting to protect." Robb didn't answer immediately. He rose instead, walked to the small hearth, stood with his back to Jon for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice had lost the flat military calculation and taken on something rawer. "I died at that wedding, Jon, or near enough that it doesn't matter which. I lost my mother, my wife, my unborn child, my direwolf, and every certainty I ever had about how honor and courage were supposed to win a man his war. I have spent 4 months rebuilding myself out of nothing but rage and stubbornness, and the only thing that got me through every single one of those months was knowing that I was still the king in the North. Not a title I'd lost, not a crown someone else was keeping warm for me out of pity. Mine, the one thing that survived that haul along with me." He turned back, and there was something almost desperate in his face now beneath the hardness. "I don't say that to wound you, Jon. I know you never asked for this crown. I believe you when you say the Lords forced it on you. But you have to understand what it would do to me, after everything I've survived, to walk into my own North and be told I have to kneel to keep it. I have knelt to no one since my father died. I will not start now, not even for you, not even loving you as much as I do, because if I bend that knee, I don't know what's left of the man who survived that wedding to make it worth having survived at all." Jon absorbed this, feeling the weight of it, understanding it more than perhaps he wanted to, because he recognized in his brother's words an echo of something he'd felt himself. Once, standing before Daenerys Targaryen with the Lords of the North watching to see whether he'd kneel to a foreign queen, feeling his own pride and his own sense of what he owed his father's memory rise up against the political necessity of the moment. He had knelt then in the end for the sake of peace and survival. He understood, better than most men might, exactly how much that had cost him, and exactly why Robb might not be willing to pay that same price twice. "I'm not asking you to kneel," Jon said carefully. "I don't even know if I'd want that if I'm honest with you. But Robb, the lords who follow me now, the ones who rebuilt Winterfell's walls with their own hands, who bled fighting the dead beside me, they didn't crown me to keep a seat warm. They crowned me because they needed someone to lead them through the worst winter this kingdom's ever seen. And I did that, whatever else you think of how I did it. If you march into the north now claiming the crown back by right of blood and old title, you're not just challenging me. You're telling every man who bent his knee to me these past years that his oath meant nothing, that he chose wrong, that he ought to have waited a little longer for a dead man to come back and reclaim what was rightfully his. Some of them will follow you gladly. I won't pretend otherwise. There's plenty who never stopped mourning you and would follow your ghost into the sea if you asked it. But others will feel betrayed, and betrayed lords make for civil war, Robb. And I have had my fill of watching Northmen kill each other over crowns that neither side can fully justify wearing. So what would you have me do?" Robb's voice had an edge now, old and familiar, the particular stubborn heat Jon remembered from 100 boyhood arguments in Winterfell's yard, arguments about swordplay and horses, and which of them father favored more, arguments that had never once, in all those years, carried stakes like this. "Bend the knee to my own bastard brother, and call myself content to live as a landed lord in whatever corner of the north you're willing to spare me. Watch you sit where our father sat, where I sat, and smile and thank the gods I'm alive at all, as though survival alone should be enough to satisfy a man who's lost everything else." "I never said that," Jon said, feeling his own temper rising to meet his brother's despite every effort to keep it banked. "Don't put words in my mouth to make this simpler than it is. I'm saying I don't have an answer yet, and neither do you. And pretending either of us does before we've even finished our first meal together in 4 years is going to get people killed that neither of us actually wants dead." They stared at each other across the hall, both breathing harder than the conversation alone should have warranted, and for a long, terrible moment Jon thought the whole reunion might collapse into exactly the kind of rupture he'd feared riding south, until unexpectedly Robb's shoulders dropped, and something like exhaustion moved across his face, chasing the anger off it. "Gods," he said quietly, almost to himself. "Listen to us. 4 years apart, both of us thinking the other one dead, and the first proper conversation we have is an argument about who gets to sit in a chair." He rubbed a hand over his face, and for a moment, just a moment, Jon saw beneath the hardened commander the boy his brother had been before any of this, tired, grieving, still fundamentally decent despite everything the war had carved out of him. "I missed you, Jon. Gods help me. I missed you more than I let myself admit even to Olivar, and here I am picking a fight with you about crowns before I've even asked you how Arya is, or Sansa, or whether Bran's truly alive the way I've been telling myself he must be for 4 months on nothing but stubbornness." "They're alive," Jon said, some of his own tension bleeding out at the sight of his brother's grief surfacing plainly at last. "All of them. Sansa rules Winterfell in all but title. She's harder now, cleverer than any of us gave her credit for as a girl. You'd hardly recognize her. Arya's," he hesitated, searching for words that could contain what his youngest sister had become, Arya's Arya, only more so. "She's been beyond the world's edge and back again, Robb. I don't fully understand half of what she's seen or done, and I don't think she wants me to. Bran's different too. Quieter. There's something in him now that sees things the rest of us can't, that knows things he shouldn't be able to know, and I won't pretend I entirely understand it, only that I trust him, the way I've always trusted him, even when what he tells me frightens me." Robb closed his eyes for a moment, and Jon watched something in him ease just slightly at the confirmation. "I have to see them," he said. "All of them. Before anything else gets decided about crowns or kingdoms or any of the rest of it, I have to see my sisters and my brother with my own eyes, and know for certain they're real and not some fevered dream I've been keeping myself alive on since the croft." "Then come north," Jon said. "Come to Winterfell. Bring your men. Bring whatever army you've built out of all this. I won't ask you to disband it. I won't ask you to disarm at my gates like some conquered enemy. Come as my brother, and let's finish Bolton together, the way it should have been done from the start, and let's figure out the rest of it as it comes, rather than deciding tonight, in anger, something that's going to shape the rest of both our lives." Robb studied him a long moment, and Jon watched the calculation happening behind his brother's eyes, the same careful weighing Jon remembered from war councils years ago, the mind of a commander testing an offer for hidden traps before accepting it. "No demands," Robb said finally. "No conditions about kneeling, about titles, about who calls himself what when Bolton's finally dead. We settle Bolton first together as brothers. Everything else waits until that's done." "Agreed," Jon said, and meant it, though some small cold part of him already understood that agreeing to defer the question did not make the question disappear, only delayed the day it would have to be answered, and that every day it went unanswered, the lords of the North would keep watching both of them, keep choosing sides in whispers even while both Stark brothers pretended the matter settled. They clasped hands across the table, and for a moment it felt almost like enough, almost like the reunion Jon had ridden south hoping for, two brothers reunited against a common enemy, the old bonds of blood proving stronger than any crown. But even as he felt the warmth of it, Jon caught, over Robb's shoulder, the careful, watchful expression on Torrin Little's face by the door, and understood that not every man in this hall was prepared to set aside the question of crowns quite so easily as the two brothers who wore them. 3 days later, riding the road north with Robb's growing host, nearly 500 strong now, swollen by men who'd flocked to the banner the moment word spread that the Ghost King had reunited with his bastard brother. An alliance that seemed, to the small folk telling the story in every village they passed, like something out of the oldest and best kind of song. Jon found himself riding a little apart from the main column with Olyvar Frey, whom Robb had introduced simply as the man who kept me breathing when everyone else thought I was dead, a description that carried, in its brevity, more weight than any longer explanation might have. "You're worried," Olyvar said without preamble, riding alongside him. "I've watched you these 3 days, your grace. You smile at your brother, you laugh with him over old memories, and then when he's not looking, your face goes somewhere else entirely." "I'm worried about a great many things," Jon said. "I've had practice hiding most of them. I didn't realize I was doing it so poorly." "You're not doing it poorly," Olyvar said. "I've simply had a great deal of practice reading a Stark's careful face these last months, watching your brother do exactly the same thing to everyone except me and Torrin Little, and sometimes not even us." He was quiet a moment, choosing words with visible care. "For what it's worth, your grace, I don't think your brother wants a war with you. I've watched him grieve nearly everything a man can grieve these past months, and I don't think he has room left in him to grieve a brother too. Not willingly, not if there's any other way through this. But I also don't think he's capable of kneeling to anyone anymore. Even you, even loving you the way I've watched him talk about you these past 4 months when he thought no one else was listening. Something broke in him at that wedding that I don't think is capable of bending again, not without breaking entirely. I only tell you this because I think you deserve to understand what you're truly riding beside, before Winterfell's gates and everything waiting behind them force, the question neither of you has been willing to answer yet." Jon rode in silence a while, turning that over, watching his brothers back further up the column, the confident straight-back set of his shoulders. The way the men around him had already, in the space of a few short months, begun to move and respond to him with the particular unconscious deference soldiers give to a commander they trust absolutely. "Thank you for telling me," Jon said finally. "And thank you truly for what you did for him. Whatever else comes of any of this, the crown, the kingdom, whatever we end up deciding between us, I won't forget that you're the reason I got him back at all. Whatever your name cost you with your own house, I hope you know it bought something worth more than any of it." Olivar's mouth twisted into something that wasn't quite a smile. "I hope so too, Your Grace. Some nights I'm still not certain. My father would call me the worst kind of traitor for what I did, and there are moments I still hear his voice in my own head agreeing with him." He looked ahead, toward Robb, toward the long column of men marching north under gray and white banners that hadn't flown so openly, so proudly, in 4 long years. But then I watch him stand in front of men who have lost everything and give them a reason to keep fighting instead of simply dying quietly where they fell. And I think, whatever it cost me, whatever it still costs me some nights, I think it was worth being damned for. They rode on, north toward Winterfell, toward a reunion that would bring 3 more Stark children together for the first time in years, and toward a reckoning with Roose Bolton that neither brother, for all their careful agreement to set the question of crowns aside, truly believed could be settled without that same question, eventually forcing its way back to the surface, sharp and unavoidable between them. Chapter 5. The price of 2 crowns. Winterfell's gates opened wider than Jon had ever seen them open, wide enough for the column of gray and white banners to pass through 4 abreast, and the crowd that had gathered along the yard walls made a sound when Robb Stark rode through them that Jon had never once heard in 5 years of ruling from that same castle. A great swelling roar of disbelief curdling into joy, men and women weeping openly. An old woman near the gatehouse dropping to her knees in the mud with her hands pressed to her mouth, whispering the same words over and over that Jon caught only fragments of. The young wolf, he's come home. He's truly come home." Robb sat his horse through all of it with a stillness that Jon recognized now as something learned rather than natural. A mask a man wears when the alternative is falling apart in front of 500 watching soldiers. And Jon understood, watching him, that whatever calm his brother had shown at their reunion in the Riverlands, this homecoming, this weight of a whole North's grief and joy crashing over him at once, was costing him something far greater. Then Sansa was pushing through the guards at the base of the steps, and whatever composure Robb had been holding onto broke apart entirely. He was off his horse before it had properly stopped, and Sansa was running the last few yards across the yard in a way no lady of Winterfell was meant to run, and the 2 of them collided and held each other in the mud, while half the castle watched and wept along with them. "I thought you were dead," Sansa said, muffled against his shoulder, her fingers gripping the back of his mail so hard her knuckles had gone white. "I thought, Robb, I mourned you, I mourned Mother, I thought I'd never—" "I know," Robb said, voice cracking on the words. "I know, Sansa, I'm sorry, I'm so sorry it took this long." Behind her, moving more slowly, came a wheeled chair pushed by a servant, and in it, watching the reunion with those strange, distant eyes that had unsettled Jon more than once these past years, sat Bran. Robb pulled back from Sansa, saw him, and went utterly still. "Bran." His voice broke on the single syllable. He crossed to the chair and knelt in front of it, taking his younger brother's hands in both of his own, searching his face the way a man searches for proof of something he's feared too much to fully hope for. "Gods, look at you. You're alive. You're truly," I told them, Bran. "I told everyone who'd listen. I said you'd have found a way out. I said you were too clever to die in some burning tower." "I know you did," Bran said, and his voice too had changed, gone quieter and stranger than Robb remembered, carrying a weight that didn't quite belong to a boy of his years. "I heard you say it. Not with my ears. I can't always explain how I hear things now, Robb. It doesn't work the way ordinary hearing does. But I knew you were coming home before the writer ever brought word. I've known for some time." Something moved behind his pale eyes, something that looked, for just a moment, like old grief surfacing through whatever strange new calm had settled over him. "I'm glad it's true. I was afraid some days that what I'd seen was only what I wanted to see." It was a strange thing to hear from a boy who could not walk and yet spoke of visions, and knowing as though they were simply new senses he'd grown into. And Jon watched his brother's face as Robb absorbed it, saw the flicker of confusion, quickly suppressed, the effort of a man deciding not to ask questions he wasn't ready to hear the answers to. Not today. Not in this yard full of weeping smallfolk. There was no Arya. Jon had known there wouldn't be. His youngest sister had left Winterfell again 3 months past, restless in a way that peace never seemed to satisfy in her, riding west toward the sunset sea with a strange, half-formed intention she'd refused to fully explain even to him. He told Robb this later, privately, in the godswood where the noise of the yard couldn't reach them, and watched his brother's face fall into something complicated, relief that she lived, mixed with a grief that he wouldn't be seeing her yet, mixed, Jon suspected, with something else too, some old ache about all the years and all the changes that had happened to his family while he'd been believed dead and unable to grieve any of it properly himself. "She'll come back," Jon said. "She always does. Give her time to hear the news properly and she'll find her way north again." "I know," Robb said. "I've had a great deal of practice these past months, learning to trust that people I love will find their way back to me even when I can't see how." He looked toward the castle, toward the great hall where, Jon knew, half the North's remaining lords were already gathering, drawn by word of the reunion, eager to see with their own eyes whether the stories were true. "I suppose it's time we went and let everyone else see it too." The great hall that night held more lords than Jon had seen gathered in one place since the war for the Dawn ended. Word had spread fast enough. In the 3 days since Robb's host first crossed into North proper territory, that men had ridden from as far as the last hearth to be present for whatever was about to be decided. Jon sat in the high seat that had been his for 4 years, and Robb stood beside it rather than beneath it. A choice Jon noticed immediately and understood immediately, and felt the whole hall notice it too. A subtle shift of attention and unease rippling through the gathered lords. It was Wyman Manderly, predictably, who gave voice to what half the room was thinking, rising with the particular careful ponderousness of a man who has learned that his weight and his years both buy him license to say difficult things plainly. "Forgive an old man's bluntness, Your Grace, your Graces, I suppose I ought to say, though I confess I'm not entirely sure yet how many of you there properly are." A ripple of nervous laughter moved through the hall, quickly smothered. "The North rejoices to see King Robb return to us. Truly, my lord, there is not a house here that did not mourn you, and does not now thank every god there is that the mourning proved premature. But we are a practical people, we Northmen, and I think every lord in this hall is asking himself the same question tonight, which is simply this: which of you sits this North's true throne, and what becomes of the man who does not?" The hall went very quiet. Robb's jaw tightened, and beside him Jon felt his own pulse pick up. The old, careful diplomatic instincts he'd spent years honing, scrambling to find words that might diffuse what was clearly about to become the central fracture of everything that followed. "I think," Robb said, before Jon could speak, "that's a fair question, my lord, and I don't intend to dodge it simply because it's uncomfortable. I was crowned king in the north by the lords gathered at Winterfell 4 years ago, by right of blood, and by the will of the men in this hall who chose to follow House Stark to war rather than bend the knee to a crown that had murdered my father unjustly. I did not abdicate that crown. I did not die and leave it ownerless, however much certain men in this north found it convenient to believe otherwise. I intend to reclaim what is mine by right, and I would ask every lord in this hall to remember exactly why they crowned a Stark king in the first place before they decide that a different Stark wearing that crown now is somehow a different matter entirely. With respect, my lord, said Lord Robert Glover, rising in turn, his voice carrying an edge of old grievance beneath its careful courtesy. King Jon led us through the long night. He held Winterfell against the dead when half of us believed the world itself was ending. He bled for this north in ways I watched with my own eyes, and he did it without ever once asking for the crown he now wears. The lords gave it to him freely, because we needed a king, and he was the only man among us who'd already proven himself willing to die for every single soul in this hall. I don't say that to diminish what you've done these past months, King Robb, taking back keeps from Bolton's grip. The gods know that work needed doing, and I honor you for doing it. But you cannot simply walk back into this north after 4 years and tell men their oaths to King Jon were a mistake to be corrected the moment you returned. Some of us buried our own sons beside him in that battle. That oath cost blood, my lord. It is not so easily set aside. Jon watched Robb absorb this, watched the muscle in his jaw work, and felt the old fear from their argument in the Riverlands Hall come roaring back, that this, precisely this, was the fracture that would break the North in two no matter how carefully the brothers themselves tried to avoid it. I take nothing from what you and your sons bled for, my lord, Robb said, and there was real effort in the careful control of his voice. I would never insult that sacrifice by pretending it didn't matter. But ask yourselves this in turn. What do you tell the men who bled at the Green Fork, at the Whispering Wood, at the Twins itself, following me? What do you tell the families of every man who died believing they followed the true king in the north? If the answer to my return is simply too late, we've chosen someone else in your absence. Go home and be grateful you're allowed to keep your lands. I am not asking you to spit on my brother's crown. I am asking you to remember that mine came first, and that I did not lose it through any failure of my own, but through treachery that murdered my mother and left me for dead. That is not the same as a king abandoning his throne, my lords. That is a king robbed of it by men who ought to answer for the theft, not a North that gets to simply keep the stolen thing, because enough time has passed that returning it feels inconvenient. Manderley's face had gone thoughtful, weighing, and around the hall Jon could see the same calculation happening on a dozen other faces, old loyalties tugging against newer ones, grief for a dead king warring with gratitude toward a living one, the particular complicated arithmetic of men who genuinely didn't know which claim held more weight and were terrified of choosing wrong. Perhaps, Jon said finally into the taut silence, this isn't a decision that needs making tonight, in front of every lord in the north, before the man who actually murdered our mother and betrayed us both has answered for any of it. He rose from the high seat, deliberately. He would tell himself later, though in the moment it felt more like simple necessity. A man unable to sit comfortably in a chair his own brother was standing beside without a title. My lords, I understand the question troubles you, and I don't intend to pretend it doesn't trouble me as well, but I would ask every man in this hall to remember that Roose Bolton still holds the Dreadfort, still commands men loyal to him, and still represents an open wound in this north that none of us can afford to leave untreated while we argue over crowns. Let my brother and I finish what 4 months of his war and 5 years of my rule have both been building toward. Let us end Bolton together, as Starks, the way it should have ended the very night of that wedding. And when that's done, when there's no longer a common enemy demanding every ounce of attention this North can spare, then we will settle the question of crowns properly before every lord gathered here, and whatever's decided will be decided honestly, not in the heat of a homecoming feast where half the room's still too stunned by a miracle to think clearly. It was not, Jon knew even as he said it, a true answer. It was a deferral dressed up as wisdom, the same deferral he and Robb had agreed to on the road north, and he watched several of the sharper lords in the hall recognize it as exactly that, Manderley's eyes in particular carrying a flicker of something that looked almost like pity, the expression of an old man watching two younger ones try to postpone an argument that postponement would only make worse. But the hall, weary of war and hungry for any excuse to celebrate rather than fracture, took the deferral gladly, and the tension broke into something more like relieved, uneasy agreement, and the feast that followed carried on with music and wine, and the particular loud, desperate joy of people determined to enjoy a miracle while it lasted, whatever complications waited beneath it. It was near the end of that feast, with most of the hall well into their cups and the music grown loud and raucous, that Sansa found Jon standing a little apart near one of the high windows, watching Robb across the hall as he embraced yet another lord who'd ridden hard to see the impossible truth with his own eyes. "You gave the deferral answer," she said quietly, coming to stand beside him. "The one that solves nothing and only delays the reckoning." "I know," Jon said. "I don't have a better one, Sansa. I've turned it over 100 times on the ride north, and I still don't have a better one. Every answer I can find ends with either me or Robb losing something neither of us can afford to lose, and I don't know how to make that choice without it costing us the one thing I actually care about more than any crown, which is still having a brother left when all of this is finished." Sansa was quiet a moment, watching the same scene Jon watched, Robb laughing at something Wyman Manderley's son had said, the easy warmth of it, the way half the hall's attention still gravitated toward him even now, even after everything. "Do you want to keep it?" she asked. "The crown? Truly, Jon, not the answer you'd give in that hall, the real one." Jon considered this with more honesty than he'd allowed himself in longer than he cared to admit. "I never wanted it," he said. "You know that better than most. I took it because the alternative was chaos, and I've done the work of it because abandoning that work felt like abandoning everyone who trusted me to do it properly. But do I want it, Sansa, the way a man wants a thing for its own sake?" He shook his head slowly. "Number, I don't think I ever have." If Robb had come home a month after his coronation, whole and well, and still every inch the king everyone loved, I'd have knelt to him gladly and felt only relief at setting the weight down. It's only now, after everything he's told me, after watching how much of himself he's rebuilt around never kneeling again, now I don't know what happens if I simply hand it back. I don't know if that heals him or breaks something in him worse than the wedding already did. And I don't know what happens to every lord who bled fighting beside me if I tell them their king was only ever a placeholder after all. "He needs it," Sansa said quietly. "I've watched him 3 days now, Jon, the way I watch everyone, the way 5 years at court taught me to watch people. He's not lying when he says he can't kneel. I think if you took that crown from him cleanly, gave it back to him with your blessing and your love and no argument at all, he'd wear it and he'd rule well, and he might, eventually, heal something in himself that 4 months of war hasn't managed to touch. But I also think if you keep it, even with good reason, even for good reasons the North would understand, I think some part of him will always wonder if his own brother decided he wasn't worth the trouble of setting aside a throne for. And I don't think that wound would ever fully close, Jon, no matter how much he loves you underneath it." Jon looked at his sister, this woman who had survived Joffrey and Cersei and Ramsay Bolton, and 100 smaller cruelties in between, who had built herself, out of all of it, into someone capable of reading a room and a heart with equal precision, and felt, not for the first time, a deep gratitude that she at least had come through the fire of these last years into something whole and formidable. "When did you get so wise about all of this?" he asked. "I had excellent teachers," Sansa said, with a small dry smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Most of them cruel ones. I learned to read a man's true wants because the men who held power over me for years never once told me the truth about their own." Her smile faded. "I don't have an answer for you, Jon. I wish I did. I only know that whatever you two decide, you need to decide it soon, and decide it honestly, because every day it sits unresolved. The lords of this north keep quietly choosing sides, and I've already watched what happens to a kingdom that lets two claims to the same throne fester too long. It doesn't end well for anyone, however much the two claimants love each other." 200 miles south, in the low gray hall of the Dreadfort, Roose Bolton received the news of the Stark brothers' reunion with the same unhurried calm he brought to everything, though the calm, this time, concealed a genuine and rapidly sharpening alarm. "They're together," Ramsay said, pacing in a way that betrayed his own agitation far more openly than his father's stillness ever revealed anything. "Both of them in Winterfell, with an army between them that's already larger than anything we can field from the Dreadfort alone. This isn't a hunt anymore, Father. This is a war we're going to lose." "Perhaps," Roose said. He sat very still, turning a raven's message over in his long fingers, reading it a third time as though additional readings might reveal some detail he'd missed the first two. "Or perhaps two brothers with an unresolved question of succession sitting between them are not, in fact, quite so united as this letter would have us believe. My correspondent in Winterfell's kitchens, a useful woman, worth every coin I've spent keeping her loyal, writes that there was open disagreement in the Great Hall itself the very night of the reunion, in front of half the North's lords, about which brother truly holds the crown. She writes that the matter was set aside rather than settled, and that several of the older lords left that feast with faces like men who'd watched a wound bandaged rather than healed." Ramsay stopped pacing, some of the old bright interest returning to his face. "You think you can use that?" "I think," Roose said, "that a house divided against itself does not need to be defeated in open battle, when it can instead be persuaded to defeat itself, provided the persuasion is subtle enough that neither brother suspects a hand guiding it." He set the letter down, folded his hands, and regarded his son with the particular patient expression he wore when explaining something he expected Ramsay to grasp only slowly. "Consider the position we occupy, Ramsay. We cannot win a war against a united North commanded by two Stark brothers who both, whatever their disagreements, plainly love each other and share an army 5 times the size of anything we can raise. But we do not need to win that war outright. We need only ensure it becomes a war between the brothers themselves, rather than a war against us. And if I can arrange matters so that each brother comes, quite reasonably, to suspect the other of treachery, I do not need to lift a single sword against either of them. I need only wait patiently for grief and pride and an unresolved crown to do the work that our own soldiers cannot." "How?" Ramsay asked, and there was beneath the eagerness a genuine curiosity, the closest thing to respect he ever showed his father. Roose considered this a long moment, the fire in the small hearth throwing shifting shadows across a face that revealed, as always, precisely as much as its owner intended. "There is a woman in my employ within Winterfell's own household," he said. "Not a great spy, nothing so dramatic, merely a woman who launders linens and empties chamber pots and hears, in the doing of it, a great many things lords believe are said in private. I intend to have her plant something. A letter, forged carefully, in King Robb's own hand, or close enough to it that no one examining it hastily, in the heat of an accusation, will look closely enough to notice the forgery, suggesting to certain lords that he intends to move against his brother the moment Bolton is dealt with, that the deferral he offered in that hall was never anything but a convenient lie to buy time, until he no longer needs Jon Snow's army standing beside his own. If that letter finds its way into King Jon's hands, or into the hands of a lord loyal enough to Jon to bring it to him in outrage, Roose spread his hand slightly, the closest gesture he ever made to something like satisfaction. I think we will discover exactly how much brotherly love survives the suspicion of betrayal, particularly in two men already primed by grief and pride to expect the worst of the world around them. And if it doesn't work, Ramsay asked, if they're cleverer than you think, or if the forgery's spotted, then we will have lost nothing but the time it took to write a single letter, Roose said. And I will think of something else, because I always do, Ramsay. That is the difference between men who survive long enough to matter and men who die gloriously and pointlessly the first time a clever scheme fails. We do not stake everything on a single throw. We simply keep throwing patiently until one of the throws lands. The letter reached Winterfell 9 days later, carried not by raven but by a lord's own hand, Lord Robert Glover himself, the same man who had challenged Robb's claim in that first fraught hall gathering, arriving at Jon's private solar with a folded parchment held out before him like something that had burned his fingers merely carrying it. "Your Grace," Glover said, and his voice carried a genuine anguish that told Jon, even before he'd read a word, that whatever this was had shaken the man badly. "I found this among papers left in a guest chamber your brother's men occupied during the feast. I did not seek it out, Your Grace. I swear that to you on my father's grave. I was looking for nothing more than a misplaced ledger of my own that I thought I'd left in that same room, and I found this instead, and I have not been able to sleep properly since I read it." Jon took the parchment with a growing unease and unfolded it, and read, in a hand that did indeed look uncannily close to Robb's own careful, slightly slanted script, words that turned his stomach cold even before he'd finished the first line. "Little, once Bolton's dealt with, we move quickly on the second matter. Jon's army will be scattered garrisoning the Dreadfort's lands, and won't be positioned to resist if we act before they've regrouped. I mean to have this North Hole again under one crown before the year turns, and I won't wait on my brother's goodwill to decide he's ready to hand it back. Say nothing of this to anyone outside our own circle. R." Jon read it twice, 3 times, feeling something in his chest go very cold and very still, the particular dangerous calm that came, he'd learned over years of war, right before rage or grief demanded to be let out. "Where did you find this exactly?" he said, and his voice came out flatter than he'd intended. "In the chamber given to the man called Little," Glover said. "Your Grace, I do not know what to make of it, I do not want to believe it. Your brother seemed to me, whatever else passed between you in that hall, a man who genuinely loves you, but the hand, Your Grace, I've seen King Robb's hand on a dozen written orders since his return, and I would swear before any god you like that this came from the same pen." Jon sat with the letter a long while after Glover had gone, turning it over, reading it again and again, feeling old grief and older fear rise up together and tangle into something that made his hands, when he finally set the parchment down, tremble very slightly. "Once Bolton's dealt with, we move quickly on the second matter." The words sat in his chest like a stone, because they fit, God's help him. They fit exactly the shape of the fear he'd carried since the moment Robb first spoke of never kneeling again, exactly the shape of every doubt Sansa's careful warnings had planted and he'd tried, out of love, to talk himself out of trusting. He did not go to Robb that night. He told himself it was caution, the same hard-won caution that had kept him alive through 5 years of war and betrayal, and the particular treachery of people he'd trusted absolutely. He told himself he needed to think, to verify, to be certain before he let this poison anything between them. But some smaller, more honest part of him understood, even as he told himself these careful things, that he had already, in the space of reading one forged letter, begun to believe the worst of his own brother, and that Roose Bolton, 200 miles south in a gray stone hall, had understood something true and terrible about both Stark brothers that neither of them had yet understood about themselves. That grief, once it has taught a man to expect betrayal, makes him very, very easy to convince that betrayal is exactly what's coming for him next. Chapter 6. The King Who Would Not Kneel. Jon's coldness lasted 4 days before Robb finally cornered him about it, and by the 4th day, it had grown from something merely noticeable into something the whole castle seemed to be quietly, nervously cataloging. The way King Jon no longer sought his brother out at meals. The way his answers in council had gone terse and careful. The way, twice now, Robb had entered a room to find Jon and Lord Glover speaking low and urgent, breaking off the moment he appeared. He found Jon in the training yard at dusk, alone, working through sword forms against a post with more force than the exercise strictly required, and Robb stood in the archway a moment watching the barely contained violence in each stroke before he spoke. "You've been avoiding me," he said. "4 days now. I've counted." Jon didn't stop the forms, didn't turn. "I've had a great deal of ruling to do. This North doesn't run itself simply because its king had a happy reunion." "That's a lie," Robb said, "and you're a poor enough liar that even you can hear how badly it landed. Jon, look at me and tell me what's happened, because I'd rather have it out plainly than keep watching you flinch every time I come near you, as though I've grown a second head since the feast." Jon lowered the sword finally, breathing hard, and turned, and Robb saw in his brother's face something he hadn't seen since they were boys, a particular wounded wariness, the look of a man trying to decide whether to trust something he badly wants to trust and can't quite convince himself is safe. "Do you mean to move against me?" Jon said. "Once Bolton's dead. Tell me honestly, Robb, because I have heard something that suggests you do, and I would rather hear the truth from your own mouth than keep guessing at it from a distance." The words hit Robb like a physical blow, and for a moment he simply stared, uncomprehending. "Move against you? Jon, what in every god's name are you talking about?" "A letter," Jon said, "found in Little's chamber during the feast, in your hand or close enough to it that Lord Glover would swear before any god you like it was truly yours, saying you meant to move on my crown the moment Bolton was finished, before my men could regroup, and that I wasn't to be told any of it until it was already done." His voice had gone rough, raw, the careful diplomatic control finally cracking under 4 days of banked fear. "Tell me it's false, Robb. I want you to tell me it's false more than I've wanted anything in longer than I can remember. But I need you to understand why I couldn't simply come to you and ask outright. Because if it were true, asking outright would only warn you I'd found it before I could do anything to protect myself or the men who trust me." Robb felt something cold move through his chest, colder even than the grief he'd carried since the wedding. Because this was a different kind of wound entirely. The particular vertigo of discovering that the one person he'd trusted absolutely in this entire ruined world had spent 4 days quietly believing him capable of exactly the kind of betrayal that had already killed their mother once. "It's false," he said, and his voice came out flat and hard, none of the warmth of the last week's reunion left in it. "Every word of it. I have written no such letter, spoken no such plan to Little or to anyone else. Jon, you believe that. 4 days you've been carrying that in your chest, believing your own brother meant to knife you the moment Bolton's blood was dry, and you said nothing to me directly. You went to Glover instead, or let Glover come to you, and decided the wisest course was distance and suspicion rather than simply asking me to my face. "I was going to ask," Jon said, and even as he said it, Robb heard how thin it sounded, how much like an excuse offered after the fact rather than a plan genuinely held before it. "I needed time to think first, to be sure I wasn't about to accuse you of something on the strength of a single forged-looking parchment." "You just said Glover would swear it was my true hand," Robb said. "Which is it, Jon? Did you believe it enough to spend 4 days treating me like a viper in your own hall, or did you doubt it enough to know, in your own heart, that something about it didn't sit right? Because I think you know the answer, and I think the answer is that some part of you wanted to believe it, because believing it was easier than facing the actual question sitting between us, since the moment I rode through your gates, whether you're willing to give this crown back to me, or whether some part of you has already decided you'd rather find a reason not to." The accusation landed harder than Robb had meant it to. He realized even as he said it, but he did not take it back, because some raw and honest part of him believed it might be true, and 4 months of war had taught him that the honest thing, however cruel, served better than the comfortable lie. Jon's face went white, then red, and for a moment Robb thought his brother might actually strike him, the training sword still loose in one white-knuckled hand. "That's not fair," Jon said, low and furious. "That is not fair, Robb, and you know it isn't. I never wanted this crown. I have told you that plainly more than once, and I have never once given you reason to doubt it except by the simple, unavoidable fact that I still wear it. Because handing back a kingdom mid-war, mid-negotiation, in front of lords who are still deciding whether either of us can be trusted, is not the same as clinging to power out of greed. But you want a villain right now more than you want the truth, because a villain is simpler to fight than your own grief, and I am apparently a convenient shape for you to pour it into." They stood glaring at each other across the training yard, both breathing hard, both, Robb understood dimly even through his own fury, saying things shaped more by exhaustion and old wounds than by anything either of them truly believed, and it was into that taut, dangerous silence that Oliver Frey's voice cut, sharp and urgent, from the archway. "My lords, your graces, before this goes any further I need to see that letter." Both brothers turned. Oliver crossed the yard quickly, and something in his manner, a controlled, deliberate calm that Robb had learned over these months, meant the boy had thought something through carefully before speaking rather than blurting it out in panic, made Jon reach into his own cloak and produce the folded parchment without argument. Oliver took it, unfolded it, read it once, twice, his brow furrowing, and then he did something neither brother expected. He laughed, short and disbelieving, and shook his head. "This is not King Robb's hand," he said. "Your Grace, forgive me, but whoever forged this either never actually studied his writing closely, or was working from something old and out of date. Look here," he held it out, pointing, "the way the letter R curls at the top. King Robb's changed that stroke 4 months ago, after the wound to his hand at Oldcastle stiffened 2 of his fingers permanently. You favor the pen differently now, my lord, don't you, since that injury?" Robb, still furious, still reeling, looked despite himself, and felt something shift in his chest as he recognized what Oliver meant. The stiffness in his right hand, a legacy of a blade that had caught him across the knuckles during the taking of Oldcastle, healed wrong, left 2 fingers permanently less flexible than before, had indeed changed the shape of his handwriting these past months, a small, unconscious adjustment he'd never once thought to mention to anyone, because why would he? Why would such a small detail matter to anything? "This was written by someone who studied my hand from before that wound," Robb said slowly, understanding arriving with a cold, sick clarity. "Someone who had samples of my writing from months ago, from before Oldcastle, before I ever fought there, which means whoever forged this has been planning it for a very long time, or has access to letters I sent before this war even properly began. Or, Olivar said quietly, someone who's had a great deal of practice studying exactly this kind of forgery, because it's precisely the kind of thing his own father did more than once during the war, when a false letter served better than an honest sword. My lords, I would wager everything I own, which admittedly isn't much these days, that this came from the Dreadfort. Roose Bolton has every reason to want the two of you tearing each other apart rather than marching on him together, and he is exactly clever enough, exactly patient enough, to plant a single letter and simply wait to see if grief does the rest of the work for him. Silence fell over the training yard. Jon looked at the letter, then at Robb, and something in his face crumpled, not quite an apology, not yet, but the beginning of one, the visible collapse of 4 days' worth of careful, fearful distance. Gods, he said. Robb, Don't, Robb said, though his voice had lost its earlier hardness. Don't apologize yet. I said things just now I meant in the moment and regret already, and I think you did too. And I think we're both proof of exactly what Bolton was counting on. 2 grieving men primed to believe the worst of each other, ready to hand him a war he could never have won by the sword. But we caught it, Jon, before it cost either of us anything worse than a few ugly words in a training yard. That has to count for something. It counts for a great deal, Jon said, and some of the terrible tension finally left his shoulders. I should have come to you the moment I read it. I told myself caution, and it was cowardice dressed up as caution, and I'm sorry for that, Robb, truly. I should have noticed you pulling away sooner and asked instead of letting it fester 4 days, Robb said. We're neither of us blameless in this, but we're both wiser for it now, and Bolton's just handed us proof of exactly how frightened he is, which tells me a great deal about how close we already are to finishing him. He looked at the forged letter still in Olivar's hand, and something hard and purposeful moved back into his face, chasing off the last of the earlier grief. Burn that. And send word to every lord in this castle that a forged letter meant to divide us has been caught and unmasked, so no other doubts fester in dark corners while we're not looking. Then let's finish planning this war properly, brother, because I think it's past time we gave Roose Bolton exactly what he spent 5 years avoiding. The Dreadfort's walls were older than Winterfell's, squatter, meaner, built by men who had understood long ago that this land bred a harder, colder kind of lord than the rest of the North, and Roose Bolton stood atop them 3 weeks later, watching 2 Stark banners flying side by side across the field below his walls, and felt, for perhaps the first time in a career built on unshakable calm, something that might genuinely have been called fear. The letter didn't work, Ramsay said unnecessarily, standing beside him, watching the same host his father watched, nearly 6,000 strong now, swollen with every lord who'd flocked to the sight of 2 reunited Stark brothers marching together. A sight that had done more to unite the North behind them than either brother's individual claim ever could have managed alone. No, Roose agreed. It did not. He said it without particular emotion, the way he said most things, though Ramsay, who had spent a lifetime learning to read the small signs beneath his father's stillness, thought he detected something almost like genuine respect in the flatness of it, the grudging acknowledgement of an opponent who had, in the end, proven cleverer than the scheme built to divide him. So what now? Ramsay's voice had lost some of its earlier bright hunger, replaced by something warier, the recognition finally settling in that this was not, in fact, a hunt they were likely to win. Now, Roose said, we do what men in an unwinnable position have always done, when the walls around them are strong enough to buy a little time, however little good that time will ultimately do. We hold and we wait, and we hope that 6,000 men grow impatient with a siege before our stores run out, or that some other fool's scheme presents itself before the walls finally give. He turned from the battlements, moving with his usual unhurried grace, though something in the set of his shoulders had changed, some final layer of confidence finally stripped away. "Send for the garrison captains. I want every gate doubly manned. And I want it understood clearly that any man who speaks of surrender before I give the order will answer for it as a traitor." But the Dreadfort's walls, for all their age and their grim reputation, had never truly been built to withstand a siege of 6,000 determined men commanded by two Stark brothers who had, between them, learned every hard lesson war had to teach about patience and cruelty, and the taking of castles that didn't want taking. It fell on the 9th day, not through some clever stratagem, but through the simple, brutal arithmetic of numbers and starvation, and a garrison that had never truly believed in its heart that its lord's cause was worth dying for. A sally port left unguarded by men who decided, quietly in the dark, that they'd rather live under whichever Stark won than die defending a Bolton who'd never once given them cause to love him. Robb led the men through that unguarded port himself, and the fighting in the yard was brief and vicious and one-sided, the garrison's resistance collapsing within the hour into scattered surrenders, and a desperate final stand mounted by Ramsay Bolton's own personal guard around the keep's main hall. A stand that ended when Jon's men, coming at it from a second breach, caught them from behind and finished what Robb's assault had started. They found Roose Bolton in his own solar, seated at his writing table, a half-finished letter under his pen, as though he'd meant to spend his last free hour composing some final careful message rather than fleeing or fighting or doing anything so undignified as either. "My lords," he said, setting down the pen with the same unhurried composure he'd worn his entire life, as though the two Stark kings standing in his doorway with bloodied swords were simply unexpected guests arrived slightly ahead of schedule. "I confess I hoped this conversation might happen under somewhat different circumstances." "I imagine you did," Robb said. He crossed the room slowly, and Jon, a step behind him, watched his brother's face carefully, watched the particular cold stillness that had become, over 4 months of war, Robb's true face in moments like this, the mask that had replaced the open, warm boy Jon remembered from before the twins. "You're going to kill me," Roose said. "It wasn't a question. I confess I find myself curious what form it will take. A trial, perhaps, before the assembled lords, so that everything I did is aired properly, and your claim to justice looks suitably righteous in the histories. Or something quicker, here, now, born of whatever satisfaction you imagine it will bring you." "You murdered my mother," Robb said. "You put a knife in her throat yourself, didn't you? Not Frey's men, you, while she begged you to spare my life." Something almost like genuine consideration moved across Roose Bolton's pale face, the closest thing to an admission he was ever likely to give. "I did," he said. "I want you to understand, my lord, that it was not cruelty. I have never had much taste for cruelty for its own sake. That particular appetite belongs to my son, not to me. It was simple practicality. Your mother would have fought to save you regardless of any promise I might have offered her. And a fighting woman in a chaotic room full of drawn steel is a danger to everyone nearby, including herself. I did what was necessary to end the matter quickly and cleanly, and if that offends your sensibilities, my lord, I would remind you that you have spent 4 months burning granaries and executing lords in front of their own small folk in the name of justice. And I do not think the difference between our two methods is quite so vast as you would prefer to believe." It was, Jon thought, watching his brother's face, exactly the wrong thing to say, and exactly, perhaps, the thing Roose Bolton had calculated it would be. A final small cruelty aimed not at wounding Robb's body, but at wounding whatever certainty he still carried about the righteousness of everything he'd become. Robb's sword didn't waver, didn't shake, but something in his face had gone very tight, very controlled, the look of a man holding something enormous behind a thin wall of composure. "You're wrong," he said. I have executed men who hunted my crippled brother through the wolfswood for sport. I have spared men who had no true choice in what they did. I have watched every single sentence I've passed, because I promised myself I would never let this war turn me into something that couldn't tell the difference between justice and simple cruelty. You murdered a woman who was begging for her son's life, under a roof that guest right was supposed to make sacred, because it was convenient. There is no comparison between us, Lord Bolton, and if some part of you needs to believe there is, in this last hour of your life, then I suppose that's one more small mercy I'm willing to grant you, the mercy of dying believing a lie that makes your own conscience easier, if you have one left at all to trouble. Roose Bolton studied him a long moment, and something in his pale eyes, not fear, not quite, but something adjacent to it, a cold professional recognition, settled there before he finally, slowly rose from his chair. "Very well," he said. "I don't suppose I expected mercy, whatever comfortable philosophy you've built to justify the difference between us. Only tell me one thing before you do it, my lord, out of simple curiosity if nothing else. What becomes of your crown once this is finished? Because I confess that was the true wager I made these last weeks, not that I could kill either of you outright, but that I might convince you to destroy each other over a throne neither of you can bear to share. I lost that wager. But I wonder, watching the two of you stand in this room together now, whether the question itself still lingers between you regardless of anything I did or didn't manage to accomplish." Neither brother answered him. Robb's sword came down a moment later, quick and clean, and it was, by any measure, a mercy far greater than the man had shown Catelyn Stark in that hall 4 months before, and Jon watched his brother's face afterward, watched the particular hollow stillness that settled over it, and understood that whatever satisfaction vengeance was supposed to bring, it had brought Robb something quieter and sadder instead, the recognition, perhaps, that killing the man who'd murdered his mother could not, in the end, bring her back, could not undo a single hour of grief that had already been suffered and could never now be unsuffered. They found Ramsay Bolton's body among the dead in the yard an hour later, cut down by Torrin Little's mountain men in the chaos of the final assault, and Robb looked at it a long moment without any particular emotion at all, as though the man's death had already been so thoroughly assumed, so entirely inevitable, that its actual arrival carried no further weight to add to anything. "It's finished," Jon said quietly, standing beside him amid the wreckage of the Dreadfort's yard, snow beginning to fall lightly over the bodies and the blood and the banners. "Bolton's finished," Robb said. "The rest of it isn't. You know that as well as I do." He looked at his brother, and something in his exhausted face had softened, finally, the last of the earlier fight's hardness bleeding out of it now that the true enemy lay dead behind them both. "We still have to answer Roose Bolton's last question, Jon, whatever either of us wishes we didn't." They rode back to Winterfell together, the host trailing behind them in a long column that stretched nearly a mile across the snow-dusted fields, and it was on the second night of that ride, camped in the shelter of an old watchtower's ruin, that the two brothers finally sat down together, alone, with a fire between them and no lords or councils or watching eyes to shape what either of them said. "I've thought about it every day since I woke on that pallet," Robb said, watching the fire rather than his brother's face, as though the honesty of what he meant to say required somewhere else to look. "What I'd do if I ever got the crown back, whether I even wanted it the way I once did, when I was a boy who thought being king in the North meant something clean and simple, something that would fix everything the Lannisters had broken." He shook his head slowly. "It doesn't fix anything, Jon. I know that now. My mother's still dead. Tallis's still dead. My child never got to be born at all. No crown gives any of that back to me, and some nights I've wondered whether all this fighting was ever truly about reclaiming a throne, or whether it was only ever about proving to myself that I hadn't lost everything, that some piece of who I used to be had survived that haul even if the rest of me hadn't. I think it can be both, Jon said. I don't think wanting to prove you survived and wanting to actually rule well have to be separate things, Robb. I've spent 4 years telling myself I only wear this crown out of duty, and some days that's even true, and some days I think I've simply grown to care about this North enough that giving it up entirely would feel like losing a piece of myself too, the same as you're describing. He was quiet a moment, watching the fire, choosing words with the same careful weight Robb had used. I don't want to fight you for it. I want you to know that plainly, whatever fear a forged letter managed to plant in me for 4 bad days. I would rather lose every claim I have to this crown than lose you a second time, and I mean that as truly as I've ever meant anything. I know, Robb said. I believe you, Jon. I think I've believed you since that first night in the Riverlands, even through all the anger since. But believing you doesn't make the actual question any simpler to answer, because whatever we decide, some part of this North is going to feel wronged by it. If I take the crown back whole, every lord who bled for you feels betrayed. If you keep it, I have to find some way to live in this kingdom as your subject instead of your brother king, and I don't know if I'm capable of that, not truly, not after everything that's kept me alive these past months. They sat in silence a while, the fire cracking, snow beginning to drift down through the ruined watchtower's broken roof. What if neither of us has to be the only one? Jon said slowly, an idea forming as he spoke it rather than arriving fully shaped. What if the North doesn't need one king at all, the way it's always assumed it did? What if it needs two, ruling together, dividing the work the way we'd have divided it as boys if Father had ever asked us to share a task rather than compete over it? You take back the crown, Robb, the title, the seat, the thing you need to hold on to in order to feel whole again after everything you've survived. I'll stand beside you as I always should have, not as a rival king, but as what I actually am to you, which is your brother, sworn to your service the way any lord would be, but trusted with real power all the same, command of the army, say, or the northern defenses. The things I've already spent 5 years building and understand better than anyone else alive. Let the Lord see it not as one Stark defeating another, but as 2 Stark brothers choosing, deliberately, to share the burden neither of us should ever have had to carry alone in the first place. Robb looked at him for a long moment, something moving behind his eyes that was equal parts surprise and something warmer, something that looked, for the first time since the Dreadfort's fall, almost like hope. You'd truly do that, he said. Set the crown down after everything you built holding it and stand beside me instead. I told you, Jon said. I never wanted it for its own sake. I wanted the North safe, and I wanted my family whole, and if giving up a crown is what it costs to have both those things together at last, I'd count that the easiest bargain I've struck in 5 years of hard ones. A small, tired smile touched his mouth. Besides, I think I'd rather sleep at night knowing someone else carries the true weight of every hard decision, while I get to simply be the sword that enforces it. There's a certain freedom in that, Robb, that I don't think you understand yet, having never had the luxury of being anyone's second. Robb laughed, a real laugh, rough and startled, the first Jon had heard from him since their reunion that carried no bitterness at all folded into it. Gods, he said, you've thought about this more than you let on. I've had 4 days of thinking I might be about to go to war with my own brother, Jon said. It concentrates a man's mind wonderfully on what actually matters. The lords gathered again in Winterfell's great hall a week later, drawn once more by word that the question hanging over the North since the brothers' reunion was finally about to be answered. And this time, Robb stood in the high seat itself while Jon stood beside it. And the hall, watching the arrangement, understood before either brother spoke a single word what had been decided between them. "My lords," Robb said, and his voice carried through the hall with none of the earlier tension, only a quiet, settled certainty that Jon had watched grow in him over the past week like something healing properly for the first time since the wedding. "I reclaim the crown that is mine by right and by blood, and I do not ask any man here to feel his oath to my brother was wasted in giving it. Every man who bled for King Jon these past 5 years bled well and rightly, and I honor that service as my own, because from this day forward it is my own. My brother stands beside me not as a subject set aside, but as the sworn commander of this North's armies, trusted with authority second only to my own, because I have learned this past year, harder than I ever wished to learn it, that a king who tries to carry every weight alone breaks eventually, and I do not intend to break twice in one lifetime when I have a brother willing to help me carry it instead." The hall was quiet a long moment weighing this, and then Wyman Manderly, predictably, was the first to speak, rising with something that looked, for the first time since Robb's return, like genuine and unreserved satisfaction. "Well," the old lord said, "I confess, your grace, your graces, I did not expect wisdom of quite this shape from either of you, given how badly that first feast's argument seemed headed. But I'll say this plainly, as I said my worries plainly before. This is a solution I can kneel to gladly, and I suspect most every lord in this hall feels the same." He lowered himself, slow and heavy, into a bow that rippled outward through the gathered lords like a wave finding shore, house after house following, until the whole hall had bent in acknowledgment of an arrangement that satisfied, if not everyone's every wish, at least the deep and simple hunger every man in that room carried for a North finally, truly at peace with itself. Later, after the hall had emptied and the celebrations had wound down into quiet, exhausted contentment, Robb found Jon alone in the godswood, standing beneath the same heart tree their father had once prayed under, and came to stand beside him without speaking, the two of them watching the last of the day's light fade through bare black branches. "I still owe Roose Bolton nothing," Robb said finally, "but I think, in a strange way, I owe him this. If he hadn't tried that letter, hadn't nearly torn us apart with it, I don't know that we'd have found this answer half so quickly. It took nearly losing you again to understand what I actually wanted this crown to mean." "Don't thank a dead man for wisdom," Jon said. "Thank yourself. You're the one who chose to trust me again after I gave you every reason not to." "We both chose it," Robb said. "That's rather the point, isn't it? Neither of us carries this alone anymore." He looked at his brother, and something in his face, still scarred, still marked by everything the last year had carved into him, but no longer wearing the cold, closed mask of the man who'd walked through Winterfell's gates a month ago, had settled, finally, into something that looked, for the first time since the wedding, like genuine peace. "I'm still not kneeling to anyone, Jon. I want you to understand that clearly. Not to you, not to any southern throne, not to anyone at all for as long as I live." "I know," Jon said and smiled, the small, tired smile of a man who had, against every fear he'd carried south with him, gotten his brother back whole after all. "I never once asked you to. I only ever wanted you to come home." The snow fell softly through the bare branches above them, and somewhere beyond the godswood's walls, the North that had nearly torn itself apart settled instead into something like quiet, and the two Stark brothers stood together beneath their father's tree, neither one kneeling to the other, both, at last, exactly where they were meant to be.